Fundamenta Chymica, or A Sure Guide into the High and Rare Mysteries of Alchemy, by L.C., a lover of medicine and a chemist. London, printed by William Godbid, for William Barlow, without Aldersgate, 1658. To the worshipful and truly worthy patriot of his family and country, William Pitt of Hartley Westbull in Hampshire, Esquire. Robert Turner of Holshot wishes happiness. Honored Sir, I myself remember that I have often weighed in my mind the worthiness of the famous Ausonian princes, in their promotion of arts and learning, by their favorable aspects in kindly accepting the dedications of almost all authors and students in the liberal sciences, which is no small encouragement to them. Seldom do we see the title of a German dedication that is not directed to some most serene prince, and the like. And this, sir, I hope will be a sufficient plea for me to present this small piece to your worthy patronage, and I am encouraged to do so by my sense of your generosity and kindness toward us, your countrymen. You remain the standing pillar of your noble family and the honor of your country, for which you have your neighbors' prayers and praise. And for my part, my contribution is small, therefore, please accept this as a token, however it may be, of my gratitude and respect toward you. Sir, this is a piece of hermetical philosophy, well seasoned with salt, and I do not doubt that it will at least help you to pass away the tediousness of some idle hours. It is a translation, and if I have erred in grammar, I submit to your censure, beseeching the Eternal One to endow you and yours with all felicity, inner, outward, and everlasting, for which I am your daily supplicant, as in truth I am. London, December 22, 1656. Your most humble servant, Robert Turner. To the reader, whose studies are seasoned with salt. When the rude, dark chaos and indigesta moles, that is, the confused, unformed mass, lay tumbling in darkness and rolling among the undivided waters, when the spirit of the great eternal Elohim moved upon the face of them, it seemed good to his great creating power to make a witness of his glorious majesty by framing the spacious universe. Then he pronounced a fiat lux, let there be light, and no sooner was his will declared than light immediately, like a swift-winged herald, proclaimed his message to the as yet unseparated fire, air, earth, and water. They, as dutiful subjects, yielded ready obedience to his glorious commands, and light quickly muzzled up darkness and presented the Creator with a newly baptized morning. His sacred power, intending further to manifest his glory, commanded a separation between earth and water, and, as a mighty monarch deals with his conquered enemy or stubborn rebel, so by another fiat he made that terrible, boundless, bottomless element, the sea, his prisoner, and confined her swelling waves to their bounds and borders. He banished them from one end of the world to the other, to run up and down in restless motion, so that though her briny mountains swell never so high, yet beyond what his great fiat permits they never dare to approach. Then, after he had vanquished this terrible adversary, terrible, I mean, to the apprehension of poor mortals, he soon spread the earth with a green robe, embroidered with such variety of glorious flowers as the greatest potentate on earth, with all his glory, could never attain to the like attire. Moreover, his resplendent majesty further displayed the beams of his glorious might by adorning the spangled azure skies with those powerful creatures, the sun, moon, and stars, which he set for times and seasons, days, months, and years, and to divide between day and night, besides the ready obedience which sea, air, and earth yielded in bringing forth fishes, birds, and beasts immediately at his command. Where now does my wandering muse soar? What royal potentate or princely guest should now be expected to this glorious entertainment? Not the mighty angels that excel in strength, but the great deity called a triune council, and commanded the earth also to bring forth an epitome of all his voluminous works, the manual of his glory, man, a naked, feeble, whimpering creature, born without sword or shield, yet into his soul the Eternal breathed the image of himself, crowned him with glory, made him a little lower than the angels, made him commander of earth's empire, gave him an os sublime, an uplifted, lofty countenance, to view the stars and learn to know their powerful influence upon the inferior world. Now the wise philosopher, he who is a true contemplator of divine wisdom, by a threefold operation and threefold matter makes his creation and erects the fabric of his world with his salt, sulfur, and mercury. The mercury and sulfur of the philosophers have been much written of, more than enough talked of, but the third and chief principle was as yet left unsupplied. Here, reader, it is fully discussed, and to the intelligent and deserving it will be a great revealed secret, despised by fools, scoffed at by bragging knaves, who indeed, like degenerate bastards, unmake the frame, blot the manual, and deface the glorious image of the Almighty. Some seek to fill the insatiable gulf of their bottomless wills in vain pleasure. Another seeks to mount the slippery stairs of tottering honor, and to make a perpetuity of his offspring. Another digs in the earth and is shipwrecked by covetous, dunghill passions. The actions of all these are not at all tinctured with the true salt of the philosophers, for in that there is no such thing. Many indeed there are to whom the philosopher's study seems ridiculous, because their unseasoned brains cannot grasp its great mystery. To them I will not bestow the time to say one word, nor here tell you the virtues of salt. Yet you see that our natural, common household salt will preserve dead flesh from putrefaction. What then will the true prepared philosophical salt do? It is not fitting to tell you here, but if you are worthy of it, the book will, and Paracelsus has already told you. Let me entreat you to take notice, by the way, that when you find any mention made of heaven, earth, soul, spirits, or our heaven, and the like, these are not meant of the celestial heaven or the natural earth, but are terms used by the philosophers to obscure their sayings from the wicked, spoken with all due and holy reverence to the divine majesty, whose glorious attributes the true philosophers and astrologers are as tender of as classical John can be. Yet I thought it good to mention this, being cautious lest any spark of my flint should touch the wildfire of his beacons, but rather that my salt may preserve the hopes of my intelligent reader, to make him dive through his studies to his crowned haven. With which desire I conclude. December 22, 1656. R.T. To the reader. This little treatise unfolds its secrets. More rich, more precious than Indian gold. Here is the path which, whoever rightly treads it, will safely lead him to both health and wealth. Salt, seasoning all things, light, illuminating. The universal spirit, giving life. O happy souls who first understood these. Here is true philosophy, so pure and good. Freed from errors, so that none need doubt. If they were in them, this would bring them out. By transmutation it may come to pass that the baser metals, whether copper, brass, iron, lead, or tin, are turned to something purer. This is a high thing, yet this is not all. That is done by chemistry. For the elixir, which renews our youth, and delays old age, if the spagyric doctors say true, is gained thereby. If these things may be done, let Saturn and Venus be turned to sun and moon. The effeminate French our author has well turned into manly English, and the Latin spell is made so easy that none need fear to understand the enigma written there. The busy merchants, for their hope for gain, sail to both the Indies, Turkey, France, and Spain. Indeed, through all the world for gold and drugs they roam. Now here, now there, but they were better to stay at home. For health and wealth are here, if they will but look. They will find them both revealed in this book. December 25, 1656. To his ingenious friend, Mr. Robert Turner. On this his laborious and difficult translation. Do not expect, sir, that I should fully treat of this discourse which cost you toil and sweat. Nor hope yet, from my more sluggish pen, that your salt should be explained to Englishmen. The sublime secrets of your chymic skill may prosper better from your learned quill. My fancy is raw, my mind is not endowed with art enough to speak of crude humors, nor yet of epilepsy, or of the gout, consumption, asthma, or the rabble-rout. Of physic terms, I study other things. Therefore I'll leave those to the chemist kings. These high-born fancies do appear to me like great Sir Urquhart's genealogy. Nor dare I, without Sendivogia's torch, come any nearer to you than the porch. Lest I, presumptuous, should be gazed upon by those that have their wedding garment on. But as a man oft feels the heat yet sees no fire, so I, unskilled, this learned work admire. The learned physicians, who spend years in finding out a medicine for the room, and when they think themselves at rest at last, they dare not write on it, it is proved at last. May learn by this, could they but find the cause, to cure diseases by the chemist's laws. Nor need the skillful operator doubt of perfecting whatever he goes about. The lofty secrets in this book laid down, once understood, will save him many a crown. There is a secret higher yet than this, for here is taught what the anima mundi is, the world soul, for which the learned many times have beat their brains, and gained but toil for all their pains. If men would learn this quicker way, and share in chymic skill, let them trade in learned turners ware. Joe Gadbury, Philomath. To the learned R.T. on the following tract. What rare discovery, what light is this that shines to us by your metamorphosis? It draws an art down to simple man, from God and nature, by which art he can know the perfect ground of every disease, and make what is imperfect whole, at ease. Thanks, therefore, learned friend, for this our gain, we who reap the harvest of your polished brain. Surely you must enjoy the great elixir, who can thus raise a subject from the dust of dark oblivion, and then transmute his foreign garb to an English suit. Thus you have changed the language, nevertheless the sense remains, though in another dress. This you have gained hereby, the world will see that you are a friend to Dame Philosophy, and for the labor you have undergone to clothe this infant in our Albion. Succeeding times shall praise what you have writ, and future readers owe to you their wit. Meantime, if Zoilus say your pen did halt, conclude his brain is not seasoned with our salt. Your humble servant, Owen Crane. Intending to say something about the spirit of the world, I shall first show that the universe is full of life and soul, and, further, that nature makes nothing spiritual without also endowing it with life, and that the world consists in continual and restless changes of forms, which cannot exist without vital motion. We may also observe that this same nature, like a careful as well as a fruitful mother, embraces and nourishes the whole world, by distributing to each member a sufficient portion of life, so that nothing occurs in the whole universe which she does not wish to animate, being never idle, but always intent on her action, which is vivification. This vast body, then, is endowed with motion, indeed is continually agitated with it, and this motion cannot be produced without some vital spirit, for whatever lacks life is immovable. But here I do not mean violent motion from place to place, but that motion which, in relation to a form, is privation, to perfection, imperfection. The growth of plants and the concretion of stones are affected by the motion of this universal spirit, which agitates this great mass, and by the mediation of a certain radical and nutritive spirit, whose origin or principle, like some primary procreating cause, resides in the center of the earth. From there, as from the heart, it exerts all vital functions and extends itself through the whole body. This root or principle is included in the bosom of the ancient Demogorgon, that universal parent, whom the old poets, those diligent searchers of nature's secrets, have ingeniously described as clothed in a green cloak, overgrown with rust, and covered with thick darkness, feeding all kinds of living things. Into his belly the powers of the celestial luminaries continually descend, penetrating even the very bowels of the earth and impregnating it with all kinds of creatures, where the elementary qualities and powers offer their services to this old parent as to the producer and distributor of all things. He continually employs Iliastus in dispensing specific forms, and Archeus in exciting vital heat, and these, Iliastus and Archeus, are as it were two instruments by which he shapes, preserves, and increases all things. Here note that by Iliastus we mean a general steward that provides matter for all generation, and by Archeus, the natural or radical heat which digests this matter and acts upon it. This Demogorgon, then, is he by whom, as by his instrument, God produces all things in and under heaven, so that he, containing within himself his Iliastus and Archeus, does with a singular providence, unknown to the vulgar philosophers, and therefore disguised by them under the cover of occult causes, form and generate, then nourish and preserve all things. He exercises the office of a good householder or steward, who has his cellar in the bowels of the earth, and from there draws life and vigor for his family. The earth, therefore, which is the receptacle of celestial influences and virtues, contains in itself the fountain of this vital spirit, from whose streams animals, minerals, and vegetables derive life. This spirit communicates to them sense, essence, and growth, as it finds their matter disposed for motion. Hence such things as are composed of a more ductile, yielding, mass, and fit for such motion, become sentient and vegetative, and able to generate things like themselves, because they are endowed with life. Thus plants and similar things, whose spirits are not confined in overly thick and hard matter, increase and multiply, generating things like themselves by seed and by propagation, and animals likewise. But minerals, whose life is neither sensitive nor vegetative, but only essential, are different. Their composition, being too hard and gross, too strictly imprisons their spirit, so that they cannot produce anything like themselves unless they are first purified from their coarse impurity and reduced to the subtlety of their first matter. Concerning this, Aurelius Augurellus, that excellent poet and philosopher, writes thus, in Book 1 of Chrysopoeia. Among these there are things which are neither the first beginnings of things, nor are allowed to enjoy a full share of life, such are all the metals that sit in the earth below, and the little stones that lie hidden with a marvelous and pleasing brightness. For they are thought to increase neither stock nor offspring by seed, but to lie torpid through all the ages of time. Yet anyone may perceive that these very things also live secretly and share in the divine gift of life, if he will observe that these same things arise and grow, increasing inwardly from themselves, as may soon be learned when the rare veins of or are opened. And if they do not bring forth offspring, nor turn other things into themselves, the reason is that much spirit is there hidden in the matter, which extends life to all things, but with difficulty unfolds its powers from itself so as to bring them forth into actual living effects, powers which human skill can draw out, though they lie hidden under a dense mass. But those things that neither enjoy life nor yet are first matter, but sit in the earth, like rich metals and precious stones, differ from the others, for we see no offspring that they generate, nor any increase of their kind, but they lie at rest. Yet he that observes their secret operations, and considers with himself their increase, cannot surely conclude that they are quite void of life. For although they generate no offspring, nor turn themselves or other things into their own kind, yet they have life, which is so chained in the close prison of their dense, solid matter that they cannot perform such actions as a brute beast or a plant. Yet if human skill releases them from these bonds, their power is such as will well make amends for it. For when these minerals are pure, they will, by their specific form, though they do not generate something exactly like themselves, yet work such an alteration and perfection in things of their own kind, that these shall equal the philosophical elixir, whose divine virtues wise men so greatly admire, but fools so greatly despise, because their blind eyes cannot pierce to the center of this mystery. If therefore animals, minerals, and vegetables, which make up the greatest part of this visible world, are full of life, what reason have we to think that the whole is more imperfect than a part of it? But let us descend further into sublunary things. If the celestial bodies give life to the lower ones, they must certainly and necessarily themselves be enlivened by the universal spirit, for nothing can give what it does not have. Of this, let us again hear Augurellus. For whatever is spread everywhere beneath the sky, the air and the lands and the wide surface of the marble-like sea, they say is moved from within by a soul, by which they believe that all things in the world live, and that the world itself draws its life from that soul. All that is contained beneath heaven's canopy, both fire, air, earth, and also the boundless sea. They say is moved by a most ample spirit, which gives life to the world and to all that dwell in it. But natural motion is always joined with life. How then can that which has neither life nor motion in itself produce life and motion in another? Motion never leaves that which has life, and whatever either moves, or is always being moved, cannot lack life. The soul of the universe, moving itself spontaneously, is the fountain and origin of all bodily motion. For the most subtle part of this mundane soul, soaring high and dwelling in the heavens, is continually carried round with the celestial bodies, which it itself turns with its own proper and continual motion. And for this reason the higher bodies are more lively and perfect than the lower, because they are continually moved in a circle, and whatever is moved perpetually must of necessity be immortal. Thus it appears that the whole world is full of life, and that the life of every species and every individual is nothing but a participation in this universal life of the world, which alone may properly be called an animal. In its bodily elements the seeds of all visible and bodily things are hidden and contained. For we see many plants grow without any preceding seed, and many animals produced without the coupling of male and female. The visible seed of plants lies in their grains, of animals, in their reproductive organs. Metals also have their seed, but such a seed as is visible only to true philosophers, who know with great industry how to extract it from its proper subject. And unless there were a certain procreative faculty in the elements, in which generation is contained potentially, many herbs would scarcely sprout upon the earth, much less upon high walls where no seed was ever sown nor herb planted. Neither would so many kinds of animals be generated in earth or water without the copulation of the sexes as there are, which afterward, by copulation, perpetuate their species, though they themselves were not generated by the mixing of any parents, as we see in snakes bred out of mud, and flies and other small creatures born of excrements. Again, how do oysters, sea sponges, and other aquatic creatures live, which deserve rather the name of plant animals than of fishes? These do not live so much by any particular life proper to themselves, as by that universal life which is general and common to all, and which is more vigorous in subtle bodies, as being nearer to it, than in grosser ones, which are further removed from it. The world, then, created wholly good by him who is goodness itself, is not merely bodily, but partakes also of spirituality and intelligence, for it is full of all sorts of forms, and, as I said before, it has neither part nor member that is not vital. Therefore wise men have called it a masculine and feminine, or hermaphroditic animal, one part holding a kind of matrimonial bond with another. And from this, by a kind of translation, arises the diversity of sexes in plants and animals, which, in imitation of the world, copulate together and generate a third like themselves. For the world produces an infinity of little worlds, for every body in the world that is generated is a microcosm, having distinct parts, powers, and qualities belonging to a little world. Thus everything has an inclination to generate something like itself, by the right ordering of action and passion, which could not be if all things were not full of life. For what generation can proceed from a dead subject, seeing it is neither likely nor possible that that which lacks life in itself should communicate life to another? We see indeed that many things are sometimes generated without the meeting of male and female, yes, even without the bringing forth of either, when the universal spirit infuses life into them by means of warmth and fomentation, just as many, by art, hatch eggs and bring forth chickens without the sitting of a hen. Others, by preparing certain materials and putrefying them, produce wonderful animals, as the basilisk from a cock's egg, or from the menstrual matter of a red hen, scorpions. From the herb basil, bees from the bowels of oxen, a kind of duck from the leaves of a certain tree falling into the sea, and many other things of like nature, which deserve admiration rather than belief, because they are brought about outside the ordinary course of nature. For certain materials in certain seasons and places attract life from the universal spirit, with which the world so abounds that all its actions are vital, so that nothing dies, perishes, or ceases from action, and therefore from life, but immediately some other living thing comes forth from it. On this account, no body perishes or is completely annihilated. For if it did, all the parts of the world would, by little and little, vanish one after another before our eyes, especially if we consider how many changes and ages have gone before us, so that anyone who reflects might wonder that there are any remnants left in nature at this day. This is hinted at by a French poet, well versed in this secret philosophy, when he writes to his friend thus: "Your changeful look, which alters all my ways, is like the sun in his contrary effects. He softens wax, but hardens clods of clay, and from what he destroys new bodies makes." Our author seems here to embrace the common opinion about the generation of the northern ducks, which the Scots call claikies, claiks, or clake geese, and the English barnacles, which many other writers say are generated from the nuts of a certain seashore tree falling into the prolific sea, or from certain shells that cling to rotten pieces of ships. The learned Lobelius mentions this, in Adversaria Stirpium, page 456, where he first seems to agree, then to doubt, and finally concludes that Fabius Columna has rightly refuted this opinion. Lobelius, in the second part of his work, page 259, describes the form of this duck or goose, as well as of the tree and the shells. Olaus Magnus also mentions this kind of duck, book 19 of his History of the Northern Peoples, chapter 9. But Carolus Clusius seems to have explained their generation more rationally in his Exoticorum, page 368, where he says that the Hollanders, sailing toward Waigatz, saw some of these ducks sitting on their eggs. Fabius Columna repeats his words, but Ulysses Aldrovandus, book 19 of his Ornithologia, chapter 23, toward the end, takes the middle course, saying that he would rather err with the majority than contradict so many famous writers. Therefore he says that these ducks may be generated from corruption, and afterwards multiply by copulation and hatching, like mice and other animals. The generation of palmerworms from plants may also well be referred to this case, for whether they are generated naturally or artificially, they feed only on the herb from which they are generated, or to which they are related. The same may be said of the generation of caterpillars, and then of butterflies, which afterward propagate their species by copulation. I saw in Rome, in the shop of Henricus Corvinus, a remarkable apothecary and botanist, a butterfly which they said had been made from the corruption of cypress leaves. It was so beautiful and so large that its wings equaled my little finger in length, and were all, as it were, sprinkled with eyes. Concerning this, as also the palmerworm, you may read Fabius Columna's observations in part 2 of his Stirpium minus Cognitarum, page 85. Chapter 2. That the world, because it lives, has a spirit, a soul, and a body. The body of the world lies open to our senses, but its spirit lies hidden, and within that spirit its soul, which cannot be united to the body except by the mediation of the spirit. For the body is gross, and the soul subtle, far removed from all bodily qualities. Therefore, for the union of these two, we must find some third thing that participates in both natures, which must be, as it were, a bodily spirit, for extremes cannot be joined without some intervening bond that has affinity with both. Heaven, which we see, is high, the earth is low, the one is pure, the other corrupt. How then shall we raise this impure corruption and join it to that active purity without a middle term between them? God, we know, is infinitely pure and clean, man is extremely impure and defiled with sins. Now these two could never have been joined and reconciled except by the mediation of Christ Jesus, God a man, that true attractive glue of both natures. In like manner, this corporeal spirit or spiritual body of which we speak is the active glue of body and soul. The soul sits in the spirit of the world as a spark from, and of, God's infinite intelligence. For these effective elevations, renewals, changes, variations, and multiplications of forms must necessarily arise from intelligence, and not from matter, which shares in no reason and therefore cannot cause such formations and determinations of form. The world, then, is nourished by this spirit and stirred by this soul, which is infused into it by means of this spirit. Virgil, following the doctrine of the divine Plato, expresses this elegantly, Aeneid, Book 6. In the beginning, heaven and earth and the flowing plains. The shining globe of the moon and the Titanian stars. A spirit within sustains, and a mind, poured through all the limbs. stirs the whole mass and mingles with that mighty body. The nourishment of the earth, of mountains, and of sky, of heaven, of wandering stars that glitter high, we ascribe unto the spirit, but to the soul we own. That these all move and stir, by no power but its own. To this Augurellus also bears witness in his first book. But since the soul is wholly free from body, while the world and the parts of the world are all bodily, there is a middle term between them, a spirit, which you would call neither body nor soul, but the one thing that, sharing in both, can bring these two extremes together into one. This spirit therefore makes seas and lands, and air and fire, to live and to increase, and to carry within them all things. Ever birds, ever plants, ever living creatures, begetting an unending line of offspring through the ages, and so on. But since a soul is incorporeal, and all the parts of this wide world we know are bodily, these two can never rightly be combined, without a mean between the body and the mind, which is a spirit, whereby the raging seas, fire, air, and earth, all plants and fruitful trees, with every beast and all that lives, are swayed. Thus they beget their like, and never wholly fade. Chapter 3. That all things which have essence and life are made by the spirit of the world, and of the first matter. All things are nourished by that same thing by which they were produced. Now that all things breathe, live, increase, and grow by this mundane spirit, and without it decay and die, is plain. Whatever therefore exists is made by it. And this spirit is nothing else but a simple and subtle essence which the philosophers call a quintessence, because it can be separated from gross corporeity and from the superfluities of the four elements and thus made wonderfully active in its operations. It is now diffused through all the parts of the world, and through it the soul is spread abroad with all its powers, which powers are communicated most to those bodies that share most largely in this spirit. For the soul is infused by, and transmitted from, the superior bodies, as from the sun, which acts most powerfully in this matter. For this spirit, being warmed by the heat of the sun, acquires abundance of life, which multiplies and quickens the seeds of all things, causing them to increase and grow to a fixed magnitude according to the species and form of each thing. On this account Virgil says, "A fiery strength is theirs, and from heaven they spring." That is, a fiery vigor, and a birth divine, are to these bodies their first source and sign. Now this spirit is called by philosophers Mercurius, because it is capable of many, or indeed of all, forms, producing all kinds of bodies, giving to some things a fairer and more lasting, to others a weaker and more corruptible life, according to the predisposition of the matter. On this account this fiery vigor, coming forth from the solar beams, is not alike in all subjects, but is diversified according to the greater or lesser portion of it that is in the seeds. All matters of purer predisposition have a purer and more durable life and spirit. For since everything delights in that which is most like itself, it is more than reasonable that this pure celestial vigor should penetrate and sink more deeply into purer bodies and make them more lasting and more full of life. For proof of this we need go no further than gold, which, being purer than all other terrestrial bodies, participates more of that celestial fire, which, penetrating the bowels of the earth, finds in minerals the predisposed matter, that is, the mercury and sulfur, which Esdras calls the earth of gold, prepared by the action and diligence of nature and purged and separated from all filth of terrestrial and burnt dregs. This matter, at the beginning, is only some kind of seed or sperm, or water mixed with that sperm, and powder or pure sulfur, which, acted on by a coagulating faculty, thickens little by little, and in time, by long and continual action of heat, hardens, and so comes to its perfection, which is naturally simple, and dyed with the color of fire. For heat is the begetter and parent of tinctures. If therefore it is certain that this heat comes from the sun, as indeed cannot be doubted, who can so oppose truth and reason as to deny that the sun is the author and father of this perfection? Let us then look higher and inquire more carefully how this perfection may be caused by this means. Chapter 4. How the sun is, by Hermes, called the father of the mundane spirit and of the universal matter. But some may here say, if all things arise from one and the same matter, how can the Son be called the parent of this matter, seeing that it itself is produced from this matter? To answer this, we must consider that if we speak of the primordial underlying matter of all things, it is altogether invisible and can only be grasped by strong imagination. Out of its vital light and natural heat this heavenly sun was produced, with equal light and fiery vigor. Afterward, strengthening this internal and essential heat with natural heat, he spread the beams of his fire over the whole universe, enlightening the stars above him and quickening the things below him. But because the earth is, as it were, the common mother of all things, the sun acts most vigorously upon her, she being the common receptacle of all influences, in whose bowels the seeds of all things are hidden. These, being stirred and moved by the sun's heat, come forth into the light. For this cause, in winter, when the sun is farthest distant from us, the earth, being deprived of that strong heat which his perpendicular rays bring with them, is, as we see, barren and brings forth nothing. Whereas in the spring, when the sun again looks upon our climate, then she rises from her sleep or death and receives life and vigor. The cause of this change must needs be the universal spirit, full of life, which chiefly inhabits the earth, which spirit, before it can generate anything, must lodge in some body, such as the earth, which is the body of bodies. And because all things are nourished and sustained by that which produces them, there must be a great affinity and harmony between this spirit and the sun. For this reason the ancient philosophers say that the sun in the springtime warms and revives his parent, weighed down with old age and almost killed with winter's cold. Since then she is by the sun strengthened, enlivened, and made fruitful, Hermes had good reason to say that the sun is the father of this matter. For, being otherwise barren and without offspring, she now conceives, bears, and multiplies her spiritual matter, leading it from incorporeality into corporeality. The philosopher Hortulanus, commenting on Hermes's table, passes over the radical principles of nature, and taking his rise instead from the principles of chemistry, understands by the sun the philosopher's gold, which he rightly calls the parent of the philosopher's stone. For all that are familiar with this art learn from experience and from all good authors that the true matter and subject of this stone has, in potency, gold and silver, and naturally mercury, and that these gold and silver are much better than those which men ordinarily see and handle, because these are living and able to increase, whereas the common gold and silver are dead. If this could not be, the matter would never be brought to that perfection which this art promises, which is indeed so powerful as to perfect imperfect metals. But this same invisible gold or silver, which by this magistery is raised to so high a degree, cannot communicate its perfection to imperfect metals without the help and service of vulgar, ordinary, gold and silver. Wherefore alchemists always add one or the other, and so make common gold the father of the elixir. But those who wish to be further informed in this truth should diligently study good authors, for it is not my purpose to speak more of it here. It is enough for me to show that the divine Hermes, with one and the same finger, touches both strings, or, under one and the same sentence, locks up a twofold meaning. He himself declares this when he states that he was called Hermes Trismegistus because he possessed the three parts of the knowledge of the world. For, having given the anatomy of this universal spirit, which is the material author and principle of the three chief kinds, encompassing the whole world, he had attained so much knowledge and wisdom that nothing could remain hidden from his eyes, and this principle he makes to be one. Thus, all things are produced from one, by the mediation of one, and adaptation to one. This one, of which he speaks, is that general spirit of which I treat, and that one by which, he says, miracles may be worked, is the true mineral matter of the stone of which we spoke just now, produced in the earth by nature from the first general matter, or universal spirit. This spirit, potentially containing all celestial virtues in itself, communicates so much of them to this mineral matter as is necessary for it to reach perfection. But leaving aside, as far as we can in this treatise, the doctrines of chemistry, we say that this general spirit is a stone or elixir composed by nature, by whose mediation she performs all her miracles. And this is much more wonderful than the alchemist's stone, which is only a grant or license given to this universal spirit that it may act in perfect things of its own kind. For, being truly metallic, purified and completed by art, it purifies and digests metals that remain in their impurity for want of digestion. But this physical or natural stone continually restores the things produced by nature, and at every hour generates new things, whether in the class of animals, or of vegetables, or of minerals. Yet it could not do this without the help and influence of the heavenly bodies, especially of the sun, which is the origin and principle of all faculties and generations. It has therefore the sun for its father, and contains within itself spiritual gold and silver, because it is the first matter of bodily gold and silver. And because the air is the medium through which it receives these superior influences, Hermes says that, the wind carries it in its belly, for which reason Raymundus Lullius calls it aerial mercury. But the earth, like a universal parent, nourishes it in her fruitful womb, and this is shown by the production of all things that proceed from the earth. For if this spirit were not enclosed therein, she would have no power or virtue for generation and production, being in herself nothing more than the common vessel or matrix of all these many and diverse generations. For the general matter, or mercury, of them, being, as the philosophers describe it, invisible and almost incorporeal, cannot be made visible and bodily except by some subtle artifice. If this matter can be drawn forth out of the arms of its nurse and purified from all accidental superfluities, it may, in whatever things it is applied to, so far as I can see no reason to the contrary, separate out what is corrupt and heterogeneous, and preserve and multiply what is homogeneous and akin to it. It is without doubt that authors are misunderstood when they seem to assert that metals alone should be used for the production of metals, saying that, the seeds of gold are in gold. For, besides what we have said of common metals and of those which the philosophers assume for the making of their magistery, we still dare affirm that, without this general spirit, which in all things is the only cause of vegetation, the innate faculty in all metals of becoming gold and silver can never be brought to growth, never led from potency into act. For nature does not produce herself, in every operation there must be some agent, and some matter subject to that action. This, without doubt, is that fire of which Pontanus speaks, which all the philosophers have concealed and kept under lock and key as the sole rudder of their operations. For want of this fire, Pontanus, as he himself confesses, erred 200 times in his practice, although he had the right matter in hand. This threefold mercury, then, or total sum, is the first seed of all metals, and also of the other two kinds or kingdoms. It is gradually coagulated and, by the continual action of heat while it lies in the mine, is hardened and tinctured when it is perfectly pure. Yet it forms several species and acquires different forms and colors according to the variety of place and surrounding matter, producing metals, minerals, and stones in the bowels of the earth, and trees and plants upon its surface, for she, the earth, being animated by the solar rays, would otherwise be barren. Nature at the beginning established this as a law, that the sun should perpetually nourish and warm the matter, continually stirring its threefold faculty, animal, vegetable, and mineral, into effect. And this is the reason why Hermes wrote that, the sun is its father. Chapter 5. How the moon is the mother of the spirit of the world and of the universal matter. So that no one may be misled here, he must consider that just as each one of us, a microcosm, has a body, a spirit, and a soul, so too does the macrocosm. And since nothing exists that lacks these three, there must needs be a great kinship among them, so that none of them can be found without the others. And though two of them may seem at times to be separated from the subject, they are only hidden in the third that remains, as any subtle and skilled artist may easily observe in the trial of fire. What therefore is matter is also spirit, and what is spirit may, not unfitly, be called body. If we consider that they are indivisible, and by nature's laws so generated that they are one and the same thing, it appears that the matter is not only matter, nor the soul only soul, nor the spirit only spirit, but that each implies the others. One is always generated and nourished with the other, so that in the propagation and action of one, the other two are always present. When therefore we say that the moon is the mother of the spirit and of the universal matter, we do not speak irrationally nor assert anything absurd. But we must inquire more closely whence this maternity proceeds. Heat and moisture are the two keys of generation, heat performs the office of the male, and moisture that of the female. Corruption arises from the action of heat upon moisture, and generation follows upon corruption, as we may see in the small body of an egg, where by the warmth of brooding and incubation the sperm first putrefies, and afterwards the chick is coagulated and formed. The same is evident in the generation of man, who, by the help of the natural heat of the woman acting upon the masculine and feminine seed united in her womb, is brought forth into a complete body, perfect in all its parts. By corruption here we mean change and the passage of one form into another, which cannot be effected without the mediation of putrefaction, which is the only means and road to generation, and this is furthered by the help of some mercury or quicksilver, which is the special conductor of the vegetative faculty. The seeds of all bodies are watery and, as it were, full of a mercurial moisture, and if their innate heat is brought from potency into act by the outward heat of the sun, then their generation can be effected by decoction. Hence the ancient philosophers say that the sun and man generate the sun, that is, the terrestrial sun, which is gold, and man generates man. It is also manifest that without the heat of the sun, the heat of elementary fire is dead and barren. For this reason also the sun is called the master of life and generation. Heat, then, in all generations, comes from the sun, but radical moisture, by the influence of the moon, whose influence all sublunary things receive and feel when that planet is waxing or waning. Thus you have the reason why Hermes called the sun the father and the moon the mother of this universal matter, for the heat of the sun and the moisture of the moon generate all things, since heat and moisture, in right temper, cause conception, and from conception proceed life and generation. And although fire and water are contraries, yet neither can carry out its proper work without the help of the other. By their contrary actions all things conceive and are conceived. The French verses may be rendered thus. Thus, in the universe, discordant things agree, and so become fit for generation to be. Yet I would not have my readers suspect that, by too hasty a judgment, I would turn Hermes' chief intent away from the broad road of all alchemists into the side paths in which I myself walk. For I know that all good philosophers, following his mind and will, say that the sun and moon must be in conjunction, that they may accomplish perfect generation. For, as Arnold of Villanova says in his Flos Florum, the philosopher's seed is not joined to their body except by the mediation of their moon, which moon is not common silver, but the true matter of their stone, which gathers together and inseparably holds in its belly the body, which is the sun, and the seed, which is Mercury. He speaks of this moon also in his Novum Lumen, where he says that, excepting his master from whom he learned the work, he knew no one who ever operated in the true matter, but that all others were extravagant and erroneous in the choice of their matter, as if they would try to generate a man out of a dog. Chapter 6. That the root of the spirit of the world must be sought in the air. Wind is nothing but air moved and agitated, as we may learn from the breathing of animals, which blow out wind when they draw in and expel air. Wind, then, is air, and air is wholly vital, the very breath of life. Without air nothing can live or subsist, whatever is deprived of it is suffocated and dies. Even plants themselves, if shut up and deprived of free air, wither and are, in comparison with others, dry and dead. We therefore have some reason to say that air is a vital spirit, penetrating all things, communicating life and consistence to all things, binding, moving, and filling all. By this air, then, the universal spirit that lies hidden and shut up in all things is generated and manifested, by this it is thickened, shaped, and made more fit for generation. Of this Khalid the philosopher, treating on such matters, says not without reason that minerals have their roots in the air, their heads and tops in the earth, as if he would say that the air causes this spirit to quicken, increase, and multiply minerals in the earth. Those, however, who have had some experience in preparing the philosopher's stone, may say that this passage should be otherwise understood. For, according to their doctrine, in their philosophical work there are two parts, one volatile, which is lifted up in the form of a vapor, then condensed and resolved into water, and this they call the spirit, the other more fixed, resting at the bottom of the vessel, which they call the body. Rosinus explains this sentence by another of the same author, for he says, "Take things from their souls, and exalt them on high, and reap them on the tops of their mountains, and restore them to their roots." On which place the annotator says that these words are true and plain, without envy or ambiguity, though he does not declare what he understands by these things of which he speaks. But Rosinus says, by mountains the philosopher means cucurbits, the lower vessels, by the tops of their mountains, the alembics, by reaping, that we must receive the water of the said things through the alembic into the receiver, and by restoring them to their roots, that we should return this water to the earth from which it arose. This is also confirmed by Morienus, who says that the work of the philosophers consists solely in extracting water from the earth and returning it again to the earth until the earth putrefies. For the earth is said to putrefy when this water is purified, and this water, once pure, will, by God's help, direct and complete the whole magistery. Some have cast air out from the order of the elements, thinking of it rather as a glue or lime that joins diverse natures, judging it to be the spirit or instrument of the world, because it is the chariot of the universal spirit. For it first receives the influences of all the celestial bodies, and then communicates them to the other elements and to mixed bodies. Meanwhile, like a kind of divine looking-glass, it receives and retains the images and forms of all natural things, carries them along with it, and, insinuating itself into the pores of animals, impresses those forms upon them, whether they sleep or wake. From animals and vegetables we learn that every spirit near the earth receives its strength and vigor from the air, for we see such things increase and lift themselves up. The spirit that gives them life takes such delight in the air, as in the place where it had its origin. Hermes also says that the air carries it in its belly. Aristotle agrees, saying that moist things proceed from the air, and earthy things from the moist, for air, bordering on the earth, moistens it on all sides, and its moisture, being condensed by innate heat, is turned into a certain kind of earth that contains in due proportion mercury and sulfur. Chapter 7. How the earth nourishes this universal spirit. Although this spirit is poured into, and dwells in, both superior and inferior bodies, yet it may best be known and perceived in those bodies that are most evident and near to our sight, of which the earth is the nearest and most vegetable. In it, therefore, this spirit is generated and revealed more abundantly. For the earth is a kind of mark or target toward which all influences, rays, and virtues of the superior bodies are directed. It is moreover the foundation and base of the other elements, containing in itself the seeds and seminal powers of all things. For this reason it is rightly called the common mother of all animals, vegetables, and minerals. It is therefore impregnated by the heavens, and brings forth all things out of its womb, and though this spirit were cast out from it, washed away, or separated by whatever means you please, yet the earth, thus emptied of spirit, if left for a time in the open air, would again become impregnated by celestial virtues and influences, so that it would produce certain crystalline stones and shining sparks. By this means the spirit, which had been taken away or separated, would again resprout in the earth. Impregnation, brought about by the action of the heavens and of the primary qualities, continually makes her generative, for from her womb come all sublunary things. She brings forth all things endued with life, preserves them, nourishes them, and finally resolves them back into their own nature. When she is stirred by these actions, she causes a twofold exhalation, one without her, another within her, and these exhalations come forth from this earthly spirit when it is moved and warmed by celestial heat. The exhalation that arises without, or above the earth, if it be moist, causes and produces dew and frost, if dry, wind, thunder, and other dry aerial impressions. But the exhalation contained within the earth, if it be moist, generates fusible metals and minerals, if dry, stones and the like that do not melt. All vegetable things proceed from, and are nourished by, this spirit, of which the earth is nurse. For this cause the ancient poets called the earth the common mother and nurse of all creatures. Chapter 8. That the spirit of the world is the cause of perfection in all. The universal spirit is the general genus and common root of every genus. For if we look down into the lower or elementary world, we see it divided into three subordinate kinds, animal, vegetable, and mineral, and yet the same spirit is in all, only working diversely according to the diversity of forms. From this arises the infinite variety of creatures, otherwise there would be but one single species in the universe. If we then consider the higher and celestial world, we shall also find that the spirit is one and the same, equal in all, differing only in purity and subtlety. The celestial spirits are produced from its pure fiery substance, and differ from earthly ones only in bodily grossness. The celestial globes and lights, the stars and planets, are made of its middle, airy substance. Thus it constitutes all things, because it has in itself the powers of both superior and inferior bodies, and because it is of an exquisite temper. In all things this body is the beginning and the end of perfection, and if it were deprived of its faculties, it could never bring anything to perfection. Here we mean simple and natural perfection. And although it is perfect only according to the intention of nature, containing in itself the rule, line, action, and power of perfection, yet it acquires powers and faculties above the sphere of merely natural things, and can bring things from potency into act. This spirit changes and penetrates all things, however gross, it softens hard things, hardens soft things, and increases, nourishes, and preserves all things. This spirit also, being in all bodies the author both of generation and of corruption, must of necessity have a threefold operation. By its dryness it gives life, or, more precisely, it awakens and actualizes life. By its coldness, it congeals, and by its moisture, it gathers and unites. For this reason a threefold name has been given to it, borrowed from three kinds of earth. They call it vitrifying, salty, salsuginous, and mercurial. For of salt, glass, and mercury all things are made, although Paracelsus reckons these principles otherwise, namely as salt, sulfur, and mercury, adding glass as a fourth. As if he would say, all things are made of these three first principles, and at last are reduced to the fourth, as though neither nature nor art could produce anything beyond glass. But I shall prove my own sentence by examples and reason. The bones of animals are consolidated and hardened by vitrification, the flesh and nerves are concreted by salt and united into one mass by the mercurial moisture. In vegetables also, the shells of almonds, pine nuts, walnuts, and the like, as also the shells of oysters and snails on land and sea, may be said to be made by vitrification. Taste itself shows that these bodies are salty, for nothing lacks salt except what is utterly insipid. Indeed, those things are most salty from which glass is made, as foam kali and the like. Some may here object that it is not glass but salt which causes the hardening of bones, shells, and the like which I have named. To this I answer that experience and reason speak otherwise. For salt is dissolved and melted by the least moisture of air or water, but the bones and shells just mentioned resist dissolution, even when long washed and soaked. As they are more or less hardened, they owe this to the glass-making faculty. For full confirmation of my assertion, I may appeal to precious stones, diamond and crystal, which are nothing else but glass brought to perfection in the furnace of nature. That all things are condensed by mercury is so clear that it needs no other testimony than common experience. Minerals have enough of salt, sulfur, and mercury in them. Stones and such other things dug from the earth, which will not spread or flow under the hammer and fire, have some salt in them, but this is overpowered by the burning of corruptive sulfur, which accompanies their hardening and vitrification. Metals, and all ductile bodies, are concreted and condensed by salt and mercury, and are hardened by vitrification to such a degree that they offer some resistance to the hammer. This hardness is greater or lesser according as they are more or less entangled with impurity and burnt earth that come upon the coagulation of their mercury. Thus we may affirm that all things are made of the threefold number of glass, salt, and mercury, or water where glass is the cause of hardness, salt provides the fixed matter, and water, or the mercurial moisture, causes union and condensation. Chapter 9. Of the specification of the universal spirit to bodies. The soul of the world, with its action and power, is expressed in all the things in which it dwells. It binds and joins the superior with the inferior. For as many ideas as heaven contains, so many seminal reasons or seeds it possesses, and by the mediation of the spirit it shapes so many species in matter. When it comes to pass that any one of these species degenerates, it may, by the soul that is in it and by means of the universal spirit, be restored again and reduced to its former state, for the spirit is always ready and at hand for all motions. Meanwhile, we must not imagine that the intellectual idea itself is attracted down, but rather that the soul is endowed with such a virtue and is drawn by the material forms. This cannot seem absurd to anyone, for the soul prepares its own food and nourishment, because it can be changed into the nature of the very things by which it is invited and to which it is inclined, and it willingly abides and resides in them. Zoroaster calls this agreement or harmony between forms and the soul of the world allurements. From this it appears that all things and all kinds draw their powers and faculties from the soul of the world, not all of them in their entirety, but in such measure as relates to their seed, propagation, and the like, by which they sprout and increase. We have a clear example of this in man, who, feeding only on food suitable for men, acquires not the nature of birds, fishes, or other creatures that he eats. Many other animals also feed on the same food, and yet each one draws to itself that which is proper to its own species. It is therefore worthy of our admiration that, from the same dish, a man can attract what is proper to a man, and a bird what is proper to a bird. This is not because there are many and diverse foods hidden in one and the same dish, but because of the species being nourished, which draws and transforms into itself that nourishment which is proper and convenient to it, and by means of this nourishment generates its like, by virtue of that soul and seed which is in it according to its kind. We must not think that in the great machine of the world the spirit, soul, and body are three separate things, for these three are always united and joined together, and by this union the whole spirit and bodily substance becomes vital. The universal soul, then, fashions and imagines diverse forms, which the spirit, receiving into the bowels of the elements, makes bodily and brings forth. Hence animals generate only animals, plants, and minerals, though not all in the same manner. For minerals, as I said before, do not generate their like in the same way that plants do, because their spirit is shut up in too gross a matter. If that spirit could be conveniently drawn out and again united with mineral matter, it would generate its like, for, by its exquisite penetration into imperfect bodies, through the subtlety of art and the skillful graduation of fire, it brings with it only proper mineral seeds, not animal, because those would be contrary to its nature. I will not say that it lacks the activity of other faculties, but only that it does not display them except according to the species to which it is applied. Otherwise everything would produce its unlike, a tree would generate a man, a plant a bull, a metal an herb, which I mention only to illustrate the diversity of specification in things. For if we consider the most general genus, it produces in all things its like, because, being mercury, the universal mercurial principle, it assumes the nature of all things with which it is mixed. But human art cannot achieve what is granted solely to nature, who alone can procreate a species. Art may extend and multiply it, if it begins its operation at the very root of the species, as prudent philosophers do, who, extracting the spirit from minerals that are already specified, duly purified, and brought to perfection, render that spirit fit to perfect imperfect things. And an expert and industrious artist, weighing these things rightly, may easily devise admirable applications and adaptations. End of the first book. A treatise of the philosopher's true salt and secret, and of the universal soul or spirit of the world. Book 2. Chapter 1. That the spirit of the world assumes a body, and how it is incorporated. We have, I hope, sufficiently explained in the former book that all things were not only produced, but also made corporeal by the universal spirit. We now come to set out what kind of body this spirit assumes, and how it both is itself a body and makes all things bodily. For that which makes other things corporeal must itself be corporeal, nothing can give what it does not have. Let us therefore see with what and how it is clothed with a body. We are not here disputing about the incarnation of celestial or supernatural beings, but only of physical and sublunary generations, and of the body of the earth, which is the sole vessel and true matrix where the first and most general incorporator of things is itself incorporated. I say, then, that no body can be made without a prior mover that can lead what is in potency into act, so that what exists only potentially may be brought into the light and, according to nature's intention, reach its final term, which is to become the body that nature aims to produce. Now this mover can be none other than fire or heat, which first moves in the air, for all generations begin there, because fire is the most active of the elements, and therefore the most subtle and light, and so the most prompt to motion. Fire, then, whose property it is by its lightness to ascend and to make hidden things visible, must necessarily receive the beginning of its motion and action from inferior bodies, that is, from the center of the earth, where, as we said before, the old Demogorgon, the progenitor of all things, inhabits, sitting there on his throne in the midst of his empire, so that from there he may govern, command, preserve, and distribute the essence of life to all the parts of that great spherical body, which is spread around him, and that he may from an equal distance more easily receive from each member what he needs. The root of fire is planted in the fruitful bowels of this ancient parent, who from there sends out a vaporous breath, which Hermes calls the humid nature. For vapor is the first and nearest effect of fire, and is so joined with it that it cannot be conceived without it. But someone may say, if vapor comes from fire, how can it be moist, seeing that fire is hot and dry? From where does it acquire this contrary quality? There is no absurdity here, if we only consider that fire cannot live and subsist without moisture, which is its food, support, and subject. Without moisture, fire cannot be conceived, for, being by nature active and its action indefatigable, it must always have something on which to act, and must never lack this object. Fire, then, and the moisture that is essentially joined with it, are like male and female in all generations, and are the first parents of the corporification of the spirit of the world, as we shall later show. Yet fire is the first operator, because action goes before passion, though the patient is inseparably coexistent with the agent. So the old Stoic Zeno held that the substance of fire, being turned into water by air, is there preserved as the common seed and first universal matter from which all things are generated. Thales of Miletus, whom the Greeks surnamed the Wise, considering especially the passive side, said that water was the first matter. Heraclitus assigned it to the sea. But Moses, more enlightened than either, says that before heaven and earth were created, the Spirit of the Lord moved upon the face of the waters, calling fire, by reason of its noble and pure essence, the Spirit of God. In saying, therefore, that fire is the first principle of beings, I do not transgress the bounds of reason and truth. Fire is, beyond doubt, the first operator and the last destroyer and changer of forms. It is their cause until it has brought them back to their end and first matter, beyond which there is no further progress but only transformation. I shall soon explain this by comparison with visible and familiar things. The first active power that begins to work in the generation of a human being is the stirring or motion of heat, which, imitating the action of fire, whose nature is chiefly to separate, draws seed from the whole body, where man's seed is contained potentially, cooks and digests it, and so makes it fit to be expelled and afterwards to serve for generation and growth. This generation and growth are always assisted by fire, which is the sole actor. So that if this internal fire should reach the height of its exaltation, being inflamed by the sulfur of excrements and the impurities of food, it would consume the radical moisture, which is the seat and preserver of life, and once that is done, the fire does not cease its power and action until, by dissolution and corruption, it brings the body to ashes, which nothing but fire can do. To make this more tangible, and to find the first matter by knowledge of the last, let us put some common body into the fire. We shall see that whatever in it is combustible will be wholly consumed and reduced to a small quantity of ashes. These ashes, too, will still partake of a fiery nature, and, as their ultimate subject and matter, they will be turned into a certain salt, whose only parent and multiplier must be fire. And though these ashes be further altered, yet salt will always remain, and in the inward parts of that salt we may find fire, which rejoices in what is like itself. In this way alchemists have found that there is in salt something incombustible, a secret elementary fire, which has the same actions as the original fire. For this reason they call it the balsam of the body, because it contains that which gives life, and also that which preserves and increases it, which is nothing else but a moist vapor accompanied by moderate heat. Johannes Fontanus, in his philosophical narrations, En son Romant philosophique, shows that he was not ignorant of this secret, where he brings in nature speaking thus. Some people say that fire by nature brings forth Nothing but ashes. Yet, with due respect, I hold that nature dwells herself in fire's heart. And if I wished to prove this truth entire, I'd call on salt to witness what is in the fire. Some dare affirm that fire can generate nothing but ashes, but those best relate the truth who say that in the fire's own breast all nature's operations are impressed. And if of this a proof you still require, salt gives you proof enough of what's in fire. That salt contains moisture is clear from how easily it dissolves, that it is full of heat appears from how readily it congeals or hardens. From this we may note that fire acts with, and is united to, fire, just as in liquefaction air acts with, and is joined to, air. For how could the dry in one subject draw in the moist if there were no innate heat, seeing that dryness, proceeding from heat, naturally draws moisture to itself? From this we may easily understand that the Demogorgon, or central fire, cannot be without moisture on which it may act, and from which it can raise a vapor mixed of two qualities. This vapor I call the spirit of the world, which many philosophers call the mercury of mercuries, because all the others proceed naturally from this one. Yet this elevated vapor is not yet a body, but a middle thing between body and spirit, partaking of both natures, and while it remains in that state, it can generate nothing. It is therefore necessary that this subtle vapor either assume or form a body, and it does so in this manner. This subtle vapor, proceeding from dry and moist principles, when raised up, penetrates the spongy parts of the earth, where it is gradually turned into a mercurial water by the concurrence of the surrounding air and of the earth itself. The surface of the earth is far distant from its center, where the fire resides from which this heat arises. The process is similar to what we see in an alembic, where the vapor or spirit to be distilled runs down and is collected as liquid. Now this vapor and its water, having in themselves both heat and moisture, become thickened, and by a gentle and continuous cooking are condensed. The principal cause and means of this action is the innate fire contained with this very vapor, which by its continual operation urges and forces it to imbibe moisture and to coagulate this water, not everywhere with equal solidity and hardness, nor all at once, but first into a mucilaginous substance of unequal firmness. What nature aims at, in giving form to the ideas of things, is to begin their hardening and solidification. This must necessarily proceed in nature's way, that is, by a gradual progression from one extreme to another through intermediate dispositions. As nature continues this digestion, this mucilage remains, and from its grosser part metals are generated in the veins of the earth or cavities of rocks. These metals do not differ in substance, since they are produced from one and the same seed, but only in accidents, which they receive from the differing places and matrices in which they are generated. The more subtle part of this vapor rises toward the surface of the earth, where it is held back, and, being in continual agitation, though it can neither sink back nor ascend higher, and finds no solid matter to carry it farther, it is compelled to pursue nature's intention. It therefore serves for the generation and embodying of individuals. To make what I have said more easily understood, let us take one particular individual and see how it is produced. This will assure us that the spirit of the world assumes a body, and will show us how it is incorporated. An acorn may be set or sown in the earth and lie there a long time, and even rot away without germinating, unless there be near it some agent that can draw its hidden power, which is naturally in it, into act. And from whence can we imagine that this action proceeds, unless from the central fire issuing from Demogorgon's breast? This fire, drawn upward and fostered by the solar rays, redoubles its force, virtue, and efficacy. Does not this germination, then, take its origin from nature's fire, which, raising and multiplying its vapor, stirs up the innate heat of the acorn, which on its own side is resolved into a vapor by means of the air? This raised vapor is nourished and increased by the first vapor, which never ceases to act on the acorn's matter until it has brought it to that perfection which nature destined for it, namely, to become an oak. When it has reached its full size and perfect growth, it begins, not so much to die as to decline, and gradually returns to its first state, even to earth again. There the same vapor is not idle or lacking, for from the decay of this tree there are generated certain animals called horselice, together with many worms, and when the oak is fully turned into earth, it brings about a new vegetation. But if anyone says that the acorn itself is what is enlarged and multiplied to such a magnitude, he is mistaken. It is plain that in this germination the acorn remains entire without diminution. Indeed, when it has sprouted, it separates itself from the young tree. The oak, then, does not grow by the extending and multiplying of the acorn itself, nor yet by a simple addition and subtraction of the adjacent earth. For then so much of the earth would be exhausted as the bulk of the tree contains. It must therefore necessarily proceed from some other source and matter, since by these ways it cannot. This spirit, or vapor, which is ordained for no other end, is that which is incorporated and produces this individual, and from the same principle the creation, increase, and preservation of all things proceed, not from the gross mass of the earth, which is nothing but the excrement of the spiritual and first matter. We see the likeness of this in the digestion of the stomach, which rejects excrements almost in the same weight and quantity as the meat it had received, although it has already drawn from that meat its proper nourishment, which is only the spirit enclosed in that mass. This spirit, by its dryness, makes itself a body, and by its moisture spreads and enlarges itself. Chapter 2. Of the conversion of this spirit into earth, and how its virtue remains entire in that earth. The former reason seems sufficient to prove that the spirit of the world assumes a body. We must now show how it is made bodily. And though in this inquiry the labor will be great and the result small, yet I shall do my best to make this thing intelligible, especially for those whose nativities have had favorable stars, and who are thereby made admirers of these rare effects and seekers of these hidden secrets. Many learned and curious men have erred in their search for this body. Some have believed that such knowledge far exceeds human capacity and is only attainable by angels or devils. Others, hearing it called the spirit of the world, have imagined that no body can answer to it but some universal body, on the ground that a universal spirit must have a universal body. Others again have thought it could be reached only by turning more perfect bodies back into their first seed and spirit, by exact and subtle refinement, not considering that nature admits no return backwards, and that bodies are, the more perfect they are, the farther removed from their principles and from their first corporeity. Some are of opinion that a quintessence may be drawn out of bodies, persuading themselves that the most subtle and volatile part is the spirit they seek. In this they wander as far from their mark as if they should seek the east and the west. For they spiritualize bodies, when they ought to embody a spirit. But since this spirit is plainly converted into an earthly body and, without doubt, generates all bodies, it must be extracted from them, otherwise they forsake the direct track of nature. And since it is made into an earthly body, it can be brought by fire to that which the quintessentialists call their heaven. But corporification begins from earth. The first work of Mercury is to make earth. Why then do they begin with fire, as if a man should build a house and begin with the roof? Those, however, who try to reduce bodies to their first being do at least aim higher than those who seek only a quintessence. But they go by a crooked path which leads them contrary to their intention. For, besides that nature never goes backwards, they do not consider that they ought to follow the way of completion, not that of destruction or of turning things back to their origin and birth. Besides the impossibility of such a course, the roads are so long and difficult that a man's natural life is too short to see their end. And, moreover, by such means they can never reach the true and natural first being, but only a fantastic body very different from that with which nature carries on her productive operations. That true matter is nothing else but the legitimate seed of all bodies. If we consider now that all bodies are made by terrification, turning into earth, we must grant that there is some underlying subject most fit to become earth. I said already that fire, in the beginning, was the first operator in the world, raising a spiritual vapor, then cooking it, drying it, and incorporating it, for no body can be made without coagulation, which necessarily follows upon the dryness of fire. And in what place can this thickening, drying, and coagulation be accomplished, if not in the earth, from which all bodies come? The underlying matter must therefore be concealed there. For if it is not there, then bodies are made from nothing, and this is contrary to the course of nature, who would have everything to have its own principle, and from nothing, nothing to come. This matter or principle, then, is bound to the body of the earth, where it is nourished, thickened, and made into body. For this reason, those who would extract a quintessence from perfect, simple, or imperfect metals would do better to open the matrix of the mother and take the seed from there, than to kill and destroy her children or grown offspring by trying to reduce them to the state they were in at the time of conception. But if they should open this matrix, what would they find there? Nothing appears to sight or sense. Many, believing this path the most profitable, have been deceived when they hoped, in the bellies of mines, to find some seed of gold. Failing in this, they despair of their aim, because they never meet with any middle state between hardness and softness in the metals. If the eye can discern nothing there, how shall they obtain anything? The one course, theirs, is mere labor, the other, a real work. Such searchers surely do not believe that the first matter is a thing as subtle and free as a spirit or vapor, which can only be reached by intellect and imagination. However, since it is contained and dwells in the body of this great parent, reason shows that it must have something of bodily nature in it. And although I have already sufficiently explained to keen minds what sort of thing it is, I shall further add that the pores of the earth are full of this vapor, which, by its innate heat, takes on a dry quality, accompanied with a secret moisture by which it is condensed and coagulated into a specific body. And as this moist nature, now dried, was originally water, so it must again be reduced to water by means of water, which alone can moisten dry things, as fire alone can dry moist things. This is the method duly followed by nature in the generation of metals. For water, running through the pores of the earth, finds there a dissoluble substance with which it unites its simplest parts, to which union all the elements contribute in due measure. This substance, by its own dissolution, is so closely joined together that it condenses of itself, through a hardness which belongs to it naturally because of its innate dryness, and through long and continual decoction it acquires metallic hardness. But since this substance is dissoluble, of what other nature can it be but salt? For nothing is so ready to dissolve as salt, and the more it is burned, the more easily it dissolves, unless it be turned into glass. The first matter, then, is salt, or, to speak precisely, salt is the first body by which this matter becomes visible and tangible. Of this salt Raymundus speaks, when in his testament he says, "We have declared before that in the center of the earth there is a certain virgin earth and true element, and that this is nature's work." Nature, therefore, is placed in the center of everything. So salt is this virgin earth, which has not yet produced anything, into which the spirit of the world is converted by vitrification, that is, by the thinning out and exhaustion of its moisture. This is what gives form to all things, and without it nothing could come under the senses. Nothing is coagulated without salt, nothing congealed. This is what gives hardness to gold, as well as to diamond and to all stones, precious or common, with a secret vitrifying virtue. Indeed, we plainly see that all bodies composed of the four elements return to salt. For if a body putrefies, what remains but powder and ashes, in which a most precious salt is contained? And if a body is destroyed by burning, calcining, or turning to ashes, what remains at the last extraction but salt? Glassmakers plainly testify to this. Hence Arnold of Villanova, in his New Chemical Light, speaking of the philosophers, permanent water, which is a dry water and wets not the hand any more than common quicksilver, says, "Who then can prepare this water? He who can make glass." The same author, speaking of the excellency of this dry water, makes it clear enough in his chemical treatise called his Philosophical Breviary, when he says that an operator can no more do anything without salt than an archer can shoot an arrow without a string. Fons Amantium says the same. Without salt you cannot bring to act one useful thing in all your art. So then, all bodies are composed of salt, and, as we said before, the principles of composition and resolution are the same. This agrees with the philosopher's infallible rule: the first matter of all things is one with the last. They give, for example, ice and snow, which by heat are resolved into water, out of which, by cold, they were first congealed. If I were to pile up the testimonies of all approved authors on this point, my little treatise would swell into a bulky volume. But, that I may prove this salt to be pure and true earth, and not the earth we tread on, which I shall later show to be only the dregs and refuse of the other, I must go back to the first creation, which I shall describe by a familiar example, an operation done in imitation of nature, and according to the same rule and model by which this great universe was framed. I said before that water, or the humid nature, as Hermes calls it, upon which Moses says the Spirit of the Lord moved, was the principle of all things. The question then arises, how was that immense and confused heap of waters so divided that this great terrestrial mass came from it? And by what means were such different things afterward produced out of the earth? I shall answer only what experience has taught me. It is naturally likely that, in the midst of those waters, by way of separation, there was a certain gathering of sediments or lees, in accordance with Moses's text, which says that God separated the waters from the waters. For there are two kinds of waters, elevating and congealing waters. The first, lifting itself into vapor, left the other fixed at the bottom, just as those who boil sea, or spring salt see daily before their eyes. Perhaps in one case this is done by the attraction of the sun's rays, in the other by the expulsion of fire. Note that fire and heat alone possess the separative power, which they exercise either by violent or by natural motion. This separation, then, was made by one of these ways. And to what could Moses better liken this fire, which can hardly be defined otherwise than as the origin of all universal light, all animal heat, and all vital motion that gives existence to things and preserves them, than to the Spirit of the Lord? Let us consider nature's salt in its own chaos, spread out, dissolved, and drowned in its water. Under what form will it appear, or with what taste will it affect us, but that of bitter water? And such it would remain forever, if it were never separated. But as soon as this elevating water feels the action of fire, it begins to flee from it by vaporization, and thus the mass is gradually lessened, until only a small heap of salt remains at the bottom. This heap comes together just as the earth did in the first chaos of the universe. Thus we see the first operation of fire, the production of dryness, that is, of earth. But as this first earth still remained joined with its dregs and excrements by the action of fire, so this salt, which is true earth, retains its impurities, even though it seems pure, white, and full of brightness. For nothing is generated, nourished, and increased without casting off its waste, belonging to the processes of formation and separation, of which we shall speak elsewhere. Now this salt, or dry earth, thus coagulated and set at the bottom of the water, draws up all the remaining moisture, and by the continued action of heat it spontaneously dries, all the while preserving its innate moisture, which never leaves it and from which it has its dissolving power. When this proportion of moist and dry is attained, it is made fit for production, as the action of fire urges it from potency into effect. And as the body of the great earth has within it the specific and productive virtue of individual things, so does this same thing we call salt, not that it can, like the earth, produce herbs, metals, and animals directly, but that it holds in its bosom the original seed of all things. Experience in the operations of fire shows this clearly, for this salt gives colors, flavors, growth, and hardness to all these kinds, and it also harbors a proper fire that the sun has implanted in it, by which it enlivens and nourishes all things. I have sometimes observed this in pursuing a philosophical operation, when I saw in this matter, without any other mixture, all the colors appear distinctly, one after another in order, and in the same sequence that the masters of this art assign for the matter and making of the philosopher's stone, together with that sudden fusion which follows when the highest redness is obtained, like that of the wild poppy. It did not, indeed, work that admirable effect of changing metals, but it exerted such marvelous powers, causing universal and natural sweats in the human body, that I dare not publish them for fear of being branded a charlatan medicaster. Yet C.V., my sovereign good prince, as an irreproachable eyewitness, can easily clear me of that wrong. For when the report of those remarkable cures came to his ears, he was pleased, like a gracious Jupiter, to visit the dwelling of his poor Philemon. I suppose he was moved both by the generosity of his nature and by the story of a worthy man who was tormented by many pains and wasted by long and grievous diseases, so that nothing but trust in divine providence or the comfort of approaching death could remain to him. The truthful account of this man so affected C.V., that he carefully examined many others whom I had restored to health by this remedy. And if the greed or envy of the man who undertook the cure of the Reverend Cardinal, my Lord's brother P.M., had not forbidden the use of this medicine, I am persuaded that, by God's grace and blessing, it would have contributed to the recovery of many who still lie languishing for lack of cure. If, therefore, this salt has all the qualities of earth in it, who will deny that it is earth? Or who will refuse to call it the universal spirit made into earth, as Hermes describes it? Yet I assert that this conversion cannot be accomplished except by an artifice easy enough to practice, but hard to discover. For it is, without falsehood, a work beyond ordinary human thoughts to make that matter visible to the eyes and tangible to the hands which so many learned and famous writers of all ages have judged invisible and incomprehensible. Of it they have said that those who labor in this deep theory may indeed speak well and plausibly of its excellency, but shall never find or know it in fact. And I must confess that among all the curious men with whom I have familiarly conversed over these 40 years, since first I gained some knowledge of this matter, I can hardly find 6 who know anything of it. When I have sufficiently shown how this salt can be turned into earth, which is the operation of operations, it remains that I prove that, after conversion, its virtue remains entire. But before I enter upon this, it is fitting that I first state what virtue this salt or spirit has in itself, so that we may afterward seek and find the same virtue in it when it is converted into earth. I say, therefore, to confirm my position, that it is beyond doubt, and needs no proof, that the continual motion of the heavens is for some end. For although, physically, one may say that the end of motion is to arrive at another place, yet motion is in fact for other causes. It is not just to move from place to place, but to move in such a manner as to achieve another end. Philosophers distinguish 2 kinds of end. One they call the end for which a thing is made, the other, the end to which it tends. Thus the end for which Plato's generation took place is the soul of Plato, and blessedness is the end for which Plato studies virtue. But the end to which the union of male and female tends is generation, while the end for which generation occurs is a human being, or an animal. Likewise, the end for which Plato left Greece and traveled into Egypt was to learn wisdom, but the end to which he went was Egypt itself. So the end of the motion of the heavens is not merely to acquire new places, but to influence inferior bodies. If anyone imagines that these influences serve no purpose, or that they fall into a place where nothing can receive them, he is caught in an error too gross to need refutation. This celestial influx is perpetual and continual, because the motion by which it descends is circular, beginning from itself and returning into itself. For this reason the things on which it acts, and which it produces, are of the same nature and quality, always receiving, without cease, the power and multiplication of these unfailing virtues. And since this influence is not extended above the heavens, where there is nothing, it must necessarily be directed toward some lower thing on which it may act. Nothing is passive but what has a body. And what other natural body exists in the world but earth? Is not the earth, the body of bodies, the only one that can subsist alone, having in itself all bodily dimensions, length, breadth, depth, and surface? Is it not the subject and mark at which nature aims all her darts? Where can she better accomplish her works than upon the earth? The earth, therefore, is the one inferior body that receives celestial influences, whose powers and faculties penetrate, warm, purge, separate, enliven, increase, confer, and restore. We do not now need to dispute whether the heavens and celestial bodies exert influence upon the earth, for experience and our very senses remove all doubt. Taking this as sufficiently known, we shall only explain how they make their influences effective. I said before that these influences tend directly downward, not upward. The earth being the center of this spherical world, they must necessarily fall upon her and fix their points there, for the earth is that point of the vast world where all the lines of these influences meet concentrically. And since the earth is a body so solid that it gives solidity to all others, whatever penetrates it must be exceedingly subtle. The heavens, therefore, being made of the most subtle matter, produce effects like themselves, for operations usually follow the quality of the body that operates. Yet this penetration would be of little use if it merely passed through, like a torrent rushing across a field which, because of its speed, scarcely wets the surface, unless it is somehow held back. But since this influx tends infallibly to the center and is stopped there, because there is no lower place to which it can descend, it is forced to remain and gather itself there. Hence some have said that the center of the earth is the most precious place, because in it all influences are united. Meeting there, they have a kind of infinite power, not only because they flow there continually, but because they come from bodies that are themselves vast, incorruptible, and unfailing in virtue. The ancient poets, who wrapped their insights in fables, divided the world into 3 parts. They gave the heavens to Jupiter as firstborn of Saturn, though some attribute the right of primogeniture to Neptune and say that Jupiter gained the upper kingdom by election, for certain subtle reasons which are not to my purpose. Neptune they made lord of the sea, by lot, and to Pluto, as youngest son, they assigned the earth as his inheritance, yet held him the richest of the 3 brothers, because within his domain lie all the treasures of the world. Indeed, he seems to make his 2 brothers tributaries in what they value most. This son they call the king of hell, and they give him the Elysian fields as a delightful region where blessed souls attend his court after death. Divines also place hell and the torment of souls in this region, arguing thus, since the nature of the stars is fiery, and all their influences meet there, there must be incredible burnings. And further, that place is infernal, because none is more low. But to say that souls are tormented there, and that the heat of this place is as violent as they claim, is a solecism in reason and contradicts philosophical axioms. For, besides the fact, which they themselves grant, that souls do not occupy place in a bodily sense, it follows that being stripped of their earthly part and bodily prison, they would naturally rise and ascend, by virtue of their spiritual lightness, which has more affinity with fire than with any other quality. Such souls, being light, could not be detained in these deep subterranean parts except by violence, nor could they, being simple and immaterial, suffer under the action of fire, for fire cannot act upon what is essentially like itself. Why then do they say that souls descend to this place to be tormented? I see no reason, unless it be this, that the weight of their sins, in which they are entangled, drags and drives them down, forcing them toward the earth center, or that sin has gained such dominion over them as to have, in some unknown way of union, incorporated itself with them, thus making them capable of suffering, not from the simple, natural action of fire, but from some violent, created action ordained by God for that purpose. Perhaps the virtue of the fire we speak of is doubled by divine power for this work, and this may be supported by Holy Scripture. I do not, however, intend rashly to promote any private opinion, nor to separate myself from the Orthodox faith, for whose defense, by God's help, I would gladly spend both life and labor. Yet I say in passing, and so withdraw more from this digression back to my main discourse, that they conclude strangely who maintain that violent burnings arise in this place because the influences of the stars meet there. I might even grant them this, if they could prove that the heat of the stars burns and consumes like our kitchen fire, and does not rather enliven, preserve, and nourish. For if it were of the former kind, not only the earth, but the whole universe would long since have been burnt to ashes. These influences, in old Demogorgon's bowels, do indeed heat and warm, but not with a mortal and destructive heat, rather with a vital one, which there implants a uniform virtue. This virtue, by means of that same heat, spreads itself through the whole body of the earth and is the first moving cause of generations. We must not imagine that it is only the external heat that comes from the sun which warms the earth and causes generation. For in winter, when the sun is farthest away, the earth still has an abundance of heat within her, as experience shows in fountains, cisterns, and deep cellars. Even in the sharpest of winters, metals are cooked and hardened in the mines. Indeed, it is likely that they are then most thickened, because the central heat is kept in and retained by the cold of the encompassing air. The sun's approach and more perpendicular aspect is not by itself the cause of spring's vegetation. If that were so, then as the sun ascended higher and its rays grew hotter, vegetation should increase proportionally, yet we observe the contrary. Rather, since like attracts like and the withdrawal of one draws along the other, the sun, by the magnetic power of its rays, attracts and recalls the heat of the central sun, which the harsh cold of the outer air had driven back into the earth's inward parts. When this central heat returns to the surface, it endows all things with a vegetative power. It is therefore not the external heat of the celestial sun, but rather the innate heat of the central sun that warms the depths of the earth. For heat is of two kinds, one acts by reverberation, this is external, the other, by influx and penetration, this is internal, and of this latter I now speak. Its nature is to give life, increase, and preservation, by maintaining the radical moisture contained in that fire I mentioned in the previous chapter. And that we may prove this central fire not to be so intense as to burn and torment, let us observe that the stars do not only cause heat by their influences, but work many other effects. For the ancients attribute to them these qualities. Saturn, cold and dry. Jupiter, hot and moist. Sun, hot and dry. Mars, hot and dry. Venus, cold and moist. Moon, moist and cold. Mercury, of all in all, partaking equally of all qualities. From this we may infer that all influences are temperate, composed in due measure of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Thus meeting in moderation, they cannot make the place where they unite immoderately burning. The vapor or spirit that comes from the center shares in all four qualities, and from it all the qualities of simple things have their origin. Some heat, because in them heat predominates, others dry, because dryness prevails in them, others moisten or cool, according to the measure of moisture or cold in them. On the other hand, the stars also send many other sorts of qualities into the center, for they give being to those tastes, colors, and smells which we perceive in sublunary things. I therefore say that the stars warm the center of the earth, and that the universal spirit dwelling there partakes of this heat. And since it is natural to heat to separate, that separating power which divides pure from impure, the subtle from the gross, the light from the heavy, and the sweet from the bitter, descends with these influences. This purging and separation is the cause why all things naturally cast off their excrements, as not belonging to their true substance. This is, indeed, most necessary, for there is nothing in the world whose excrements do not exceed its natural substance. In fact, all that we see and touch is for the most part only the excremental part of things, overshadowing their hidden substance. We may see this in our food, the bulk of it does not turn into our substance, but passes away by those channels appointed for such egress. Nature draws only the invisible and spiritual juice from it, which is fit to be changed into our flesh and substance. In the same way, we may affirm that this mass of earth we tread upon is nothing but the excrement of that first substance which was united in the chaos, now surrounding the center and enclosing it in a spherical, balanced proportion so that it cannot move or fall. For being in the lowest place, it cannot tend any farther downward unless it should ascend, which is contrary to its nature. Yet, in saying this, I do not mean that the whole body of the earth is nothing but excrement. For though it appears wholly excrementitious, still, beneath these excrements there lies a pure substance which, being entirely spiritual, could not become perceptible without the help of some body. We see this in all generated things, their seed and first matter are invisible, but, as they are carried in a bodily mass and excrementitious covering, we can see them. No body can be made without excrements. For this reason that inner substance is separated from the gross body of the earth, in generations, by the influence of celestial heat, retaining of the earth nothing more than is needed to serve as a support. From the beginning this earth had no other purpose than to be a receptacle and workshop, or rather, a vessel, in which this spiritual matter might carry out its operations. How this is done by separation I shall plainly and at large demonstrate in the next chapter. But separation would be of little use if the things separated remained without action. Nature's aim in separating is to give life and drive out death, which comes from nothing else but a superabundance of excrement suffocating the pure substance. Here I speak of natural death, not violent. If the seeds of things were always to lie buried in this excrementitious earth, nothing would be produced or receive life. But celestial power, by its vital influence, draws them out, and these seeds, being full of virtue, expand and unfold themselves into every species, each according to its own nature and composition. Life, then, proceeds from purification, which the stars bring about by their influences, together with augmenting and restorative powers that come down with them. For the stars are in continual motion, and therefore are always in action, and consequently always vivifying, giving life to what already lives. This cannot be done without at the same time preserving and restoring. They grant preservation by sustaining life without interruption, and restoration, by renewing what the generations of individuals consume and waste. We may see this clearly in the first matter once it is embodied, for, impregnated with celestial influences, it is of itself nourished, multiplied, and continually increased. Hence it is called a dragon or serpent that devours itself, always regerminating. Wherever it is, it takes such root that the place is never entirely devoid of it, not even if it be washed or burned. This is a sure mark by which the first matter may be known. These, then, are the chief virtues which the spirit of the world has, and will always receive from celestial influences, and by these it works great and admirable effects in all the members of the universe. But here some may ask how it is that the first matter, receiving such pure and powerful influences from heaven, becomes so stained with vicious qualities, and how it retains them, seeing it is always busied with vivifying, increasing, preserving, and restoring. For if it did not separate, purge, it would die, and if it did not increase, preserve, and restore, it would diminish, fail, and grow weak, which it never does. To this I answer, the stars have a twofold influence, one natural, the other accidental. The natural influence was given them at their first creation. It is that universal government of the world of which Hermes speaks, by which they keep it in being, and defend it from destruction and annihilation by their continual influx. With this influx the spirit of the universe is constantly enriched, and applies it to all things, manifesting it wherever it gives increase and substance. The accidental influence of the stars is that which arises in an unusual or preternatural way, from their differing positions and aspects. This is always subject to change and never remains the same. It has power only over effects in matter, not over the matter itself. For whatever influences may occur, however malign, the center of the earth does not suspend its operations, it continues as before, producing animals, plants, and minerals as well as ever. If death or decay sometimes arises from some malignant aspect, it affects only the surface or excrementitious part of bodies, not their inner substance. And such accidents often pass, so that the same influence may at one time cause one effect, and at another time quite the contrary. The natural and principal influx never behaves so. From this we may conclude that the first matter, being simple in itself, receives nothing but those celestial virtues, which it also keeps and holds fast even when it is turned into earth. We must now explain how it retains them, so that we may confirm Hermes' saying, that its virtue remains whole when it is converted into earth, because all heavenly virtues descend and meet in the center of the earth, and in their course intend nothing but the informing of matter, which is, as it were, the receptacle of the supreme ideas. This same matter, being full of forms, is distinguished, not actually, but potentially, into innumerable specific natures. Thus it is not, strictly speaking, a body, but as it were a body, or companion of a body, toward which it has an appetite and which it strives to inform. This striving or motion it has from the action of celestial fire, which I before called the first mover in the chaos. The ancient poets Orpheus and Hesiod described this under the name of love. And Ronsard, our French Homer, or Pindar, portrays it thus. I am love, the great master of the gods. I am the one who makes the heavens move. I am the one who governs all the world. I, firstborn from the formless mass of things, spread light abroad and kindled ancient chaos, from which this rounded fabric of the world was built. Since this matter, by its own nature and appetite, tends toward having a body, who can reasonably say that, while it assumes a body, it is deprived of or departs from that very nature by which it causes embodiment? And since, when it takes a body, it is first turned into earth, who can deny that this earth is endowed with the same virtue? Though, through mixture and contact, it may take on some elementary impurities, yet at its center it is always pure. Once purified, fire, though it be the most active and powerful of the elements, cannot destroy it, because this earth exceeds fire in perfection and subtlety. From this comes its ability so swiftly to penetrate bodies, enliven them, and increase their virtues, by restoring and preserving what is natural in them, namely their radical moisture, which it purifies and frees from the excrements that choke and suffocate it by its own fiery subtlety. To sum all up in a word, this is that most excellent medicine which Sirach says is drawn out of the earth, and which no wise man will despise. It is, moreover, that precious salt to which the Doctor of Doctors, Christ, compared his apostles, as to a most exquisite treasure produced by the heavens. For he might as well have said, "You are diamonds, rubies, pearls, gold or silver of the earth," but he knew that all these things, however admirable, contain nothing in them comparable to this general salt, to which all the rest owe the homage of their perfection. This medicine works like fire, consuming what is impure. It separates the heterogeneous excrements from the homogeneous, pure substance. And since heaven generated this virgin in the bowels of the earth, why should she not retain her parents' virtues, and, like a child who naturally shares both paternal and maternal seed, carry within her both paternal and maternal humors? For this reason the ancients called this offspring androgynos, a name common to both sexes, the poets, an hermaphrodite, not simply male nor female, but both. No less properly may this virgin be called Uranogia, that is, heaven turned into earth. For although she is earth, she has the celestial virtues tied and indissolubly fastened to her, and she demonstrates their marvelous powers in her operations. Of these I have sufficiently spoken in the preceding chapters, for all who, endowed with any noble spark of wit, will dare to break through the dense woods of darkness and ignorance, or for those whom, as Virgil says, heaven has allowed to descend into the obscure chaos beneath the earth. Chapter 3. Of the separation of fire from water, subtle from thick, and with what industry it should be done. Nature, that most wise agent, teaches us by her own operations that in all things we must first consider the end for which we undertake a work, and then find fitting means to attain that end. A prudent searcher of nature's secrets must therefore have a clear knowledge of the principles, progress, and qualities of matter, both inward and outward, lest in his inquiry he confuse his end with his means, and, forsaking the great road which nature has trodden from the foundation of the world, turn aside into byways and fantastical, unknown, and rarely traveled paths. Hermes knew the right way well, for he possessed a perfect knowledge of the construction of the world. Desiring, by art, to follow the footsteps of nature, he wisely judged that earth is the principle of all things, and the first creature that, by separation, was made in the belly of the chaos. From this principle he gained entrance into the treasury of nature's secrets, by the terrification, turning into earth, of the first matter, which I said before was nourished in the matrix of the earth. But as it is not enough for a builder merely to have materials ready to erect an edifice, unless he also knows how to work them and fit them for the building, so Hermes was not content only to find out the proper matter. He also made diligent search for the method by which he might pursue his work in imitation of the chief workman in the creation of the universe, and so form a little world, microcosm, in which all the virtues of the greater world should be contained. Considering, then, that the thing Hermes intended to make must be most perfect, and that he had to begin with the coarser and lower things in order to reach this perfection, he first began by dividing contrary natures, separating out the superfluous and useless parts so as not to ruin his work. In this, according to the proverb, it may truly be said that he took the bird by the feet, that is, he took hold of the matter in the right way from the very start. Thus, going through the right gate, he entered into nature's secret chamber without turning aside. For separation is the beginning of all things, and the first operation of the universal body, which separates the confused members of the whole. By dividing the confused mass or chaos, the order and form of the elements first appeared and took their stations. Without separation, day and night, sun and moon, winter and summer, would still be one, metals and minerals, however different, would all be contained in one undistinguished body, and all plants would exist as only one undifferentiated seed. It was therefore necessary that nature, in order to attain that order and distinction with which we see the universe adorned, should begin with separation. But that we may come down to particulars, let us see how this wise agent begins all her operations. Without separation, generation could neither begin nor continue. By separation, aliments, foods, increase and preserve every body. If I were to carry this proof through every species, would inevitably lose myself in the maze of this chaos and never find my way out, because of the infinity of examples. I will therefore lay down this as a foundation: nature begins all her actions with separation. But the bare knowledge of this is not sufficient, unless we also know what things she separates and whence this separating power proceeds. We must consider this more accurately, so that our discourse may move in an orderly way. And before I handle the details, I think it best to give some definition of separation, and to state how many kinds of separation there are. Separation, in general, is nothing else but the division and differentiation of dissimilar things, as of heaven from earth, sun from moon, and the like, and also of the pure from the impure, hot from cold, dry from moist, and so on. From this definition we may derive two kinds of separation. The first kind is the separation, or distinction, of things that differ only simply, and not as contraries, for example, the parts of the world which were first divided out of the chaos, or, to come down to particulars, wood from bark, leaves from fruit, roots from branches. This kind of separation may properly be called distinction. In such cases, the parts are not utterly divided from one another in their deeper nature, whether we consider the great members of the world or its particular parts. For though heaven and earth may seem separated as higher and lower in position, yet they are not divided in reality, since there is a continual connection and affinity between them, as appears in many places of this book. Hence also Homer, no less a philosopher than a poet, said that the earth is bound to heaven by a golden chain. In the same way, leaves and fruits, wood and bark, branches and roots are not separated and divided as contraries, they are only distinguished by their proper places and adornments, while still retaining a certain affinity and mutual bond. Each supports the other, while preserving its own place. The second kind of separation is the removal or division of things that are totally different, contrary, or superfluous, things that have no natural connection with the substance, such as pure and impure, hot and cold, gross and subtle, and the like. I do not mean that such contraries cannot be joined, but that their union and mixture, because of their disparity, tends to destruction, or at the very least hinders the proper action of the natural virtue of the pure substance. This kind of separation may be properly called decision or division, which nature employs in all her productions so that the proper actions and virtues of each thing may be set free. The first kind is only a distinction of parts truly dissimilar in position and shape, yet homogeneous in virtue and substance. For it is certain that the wood, bark, and all the parts of a tree share one innate virtue, peculiar to that tree in particular, and common to all its parts in general. As to its subordinate parts, some may receive more or less of that substance or virtue, yet none receive a contrary one. One and the same cause does not bring forth things that are diametrically opposed from the same matter. A wholesome plant does not emit a poisonous virtue from one part and a healing one from another. It may, indeed, be wholesome to one kind of body and deadly to another. Thus hellebore nourishes quails but kills men. Yet one plant cannot exercise opposite powers upon one and the same subject. Hellebore cannot both nourish and kill quails, nor both intoxicate and nourish a man. The proper virtue of the plant is present in the whole plant, and any part of it. One part of the plant may differ from another in position and appearance, but not in substance and essential virtue. Leaves and fruits share one and the same substance and virtue, though one may contain more of that virtue than another. Some may object that cabbage, brassica, seems to produce different effects. According to common opinion, its decoction loosens the belly, but its pulp binds it. I answer that if it belongs to the substance of this plant to loosen, then it is impossible that it should also bind. To speak plainly, the pulp that remains after boiling is not the true substance of the plant. This appears clearly in the work of the stomach, which takes the substance of cabbage for nourishment, but rejects the pulp as an excrement that has no nutritive power. The nutritive power lies wholly in the true substance and in each part of that substance. Now substance has this property: it does not admit a contrary, but only more or less of the same quality, and this applies both to its actions and to its power, though not to its essence. We see a parallel in man. No part of a man is more a part of man than another, though one may be greater or more powerful in virtue and action. The same holds in simples or plants, where some parts are more or less hot, cold, moist, or dry, as their colors and tastes show, yet they are not contraries. One part of a plant cannot kill by cold while another kills by heat. Experience, however, shows us that the tips of branches and the flowers are more subtle in operation than the trunk and lower parts. For it belongs to every substance that its more subtle and pure parts ascend, while the impure parts settle down and remain nearest to the excrements. Nature observes this for two reasons. First, that she may adorn the plant, and by the variety of its digestion make it pleasant to behold. Second, that she may offer to man or other animals what is necessary for the preservation of their essence in a greater or lesser degree, acting like a careful and provident mother who prepares everything needed and fitting, each thing in its own degree, as far as her industry or ability can supply. For nature never goes beyond simple perfection, and flowers and seeds are the most perfect parts in herbs which she has elaborated. Art, beginning where nature ends, may bring these things to a still higher perfection by the same way nature used, namely, separation, as we shall further explain. Nature, therefore, by this first kind of separation, does nothing but distinguish things, for the ornament of the subject and for the use of man, other animals, or some part of the world. Among these she has sown and planted a mutual love and reciprocal affinity, so that all things naturally, and by a kind of sympathy, tend to one another's help and service. But the second kind of separation is different. By it, nature, or art, in imitation of nature, divides and removes contraries, that is, it draws away from the substance what is not of its essence, but is rather hostile to it. Such things live together with the substance, though they do not belong to it, pure with impure, subtle with gross, substance with its excrements. This second kind of separation is also used for two reasons: that the pure substance may be preserved from corruption and death, that it may more freely exercise its virtues and activities, being freed from its coarse dregs. For when that which is impure occupies and encloses that which is purely substantial, it never ceases to oppress it until it has completely conquered and suffocated it, making way for mortal corruption. Corruption never approaches things that are simple and pure, it haunts all foul and impure things. Every true substance is of itself simple and pure, and therefore, in itself, not subject to corruption and death. We see this in the higher, celestial things, which are free from excrements. But lower bodies are otherwise, they lie immersed in the midst of this world's impure excrements, which naturally destroy and kill their guests, whereas purity gives life and preserves. Corruptions and deaths beset men because of the crowd of dregs and excrements that infest them, causing them to live a short and miserable life, weighed down with afflictions and diseases. They are held here like a condemned prisoner in a dark and filthy dungeon, who, doubtful between death and hope of life, lies covered with mold, plagued with vermin, and fed with foul and corrupted food. For all aliments are impure, and carry with them an executioner, hidden poison. Thus in the end we take our own death in our own hands and kill ourselves unawares, for our food contains so little of true enlivening and nourishing virtue, and that enclosed in so much excrement, that even a strong stomach can scarcely draw it out. When we eat such food, we take in poison along with the good substance, and once this poison enters our bodies, it never ceases to increase and accumulate until it dims and extinguishes the vital light, or rather, nature's rightful activity, which is to give life, unless some medicine or separation delays or suspends its effect. Corruption, then, is brought about by excrements, and this can happen in two ways. First, from the seed of the parents, when they themselves are not sound, and therefore corrupt, they produce corrupt seed, which degenerates more and more from generation to generation. Yet this kind of corruption can, to some extent, be held in check by medicine, so that its tendency toward death and destruction may be slowed or delayed. This corruption may not improperly be called that malevolent Satan who goes about continually seeking whom he may devour. For this reason it wanders over the whole globe, over the excrements of the world, which have their principal seat on the earth and belch out their corruption upon the other elements as well. Thus men, living from these things and in these things, are corrupted in them and by them, and so produce corrupt seed, which time makes ever more corrupt. For our own age, being more vicious and dissolute than that of our ancestors, has made us worse than they were, and it is likely that the next generation will be worse than we, and the following one even more dissolute still. The second source of corruption is the continual use of food that is too excrementitious, by which our bodies are depraved, so that this infection passes from parent to child, as we see in leprosy and other hereditary diseases. Now these foods derive their corruption from the place where they are produced. After the Almighty had ordered the confused chaos, he arranged that the higher bodies should remain pure and subtle, but the lower ones gross and impure, because it is the nature of pure substances to rise towards their origin, and of excrements to sink toward the center. From this it follows that whatever is pure in animals and plants rises and ascends to the higher parts, and causes them to grow upward with it, until it is freed from the excrementitious mass that subjects it to death, and so gains the place furthest removed from filth, where it may live without stain or change. For the same reason, more spiritual and subtle creatures inhabit higher regions, as being purer, and finding there a nourishment more like their own nature. But corporeal creatures dwell in lower regions, immersed in dregs and filth that have their place in the lower parts. From these they are corrupted, because what they live on is mingled with the world's dregs. For whatever the earth and the other elements, which are the receptacles of impurities, can produce is corrupt and stained, and therefore spreads corruption and defilement on all bodies that use it for food. Thus the blood comes into a bad condition, and from this arise bad humors, more in some persons, less in others, according to the degree of their parents' taint and the abuse of corrupting things that cause death and destruction. For if the earth and its fruits were as pure as the heavens, then all animals would live as long as the celestial inhabitants. But nature has laid down this law, that what partakes most of corporeity should dwell near that which is most corporeal, and that which is most corruptible and foul, near that which is like it. The earth, therefore, as the lowest of bodies, is the most gross and corruptible. Nothing can come forth from it but what resembles it, unless its corruption and impurity be checked by the art of separation, and all its pure substance be extracted from its body, which a true philosopher may accomplish by industry. It has never been, nor is it now, my intention to offend physicians, to whom I owe much honor. Yet I, together with many learned men, marvel that they do not better instruct apothecaries to be more careful in the preparation of medicines, especially since the physicians themselves often see how frequently they are disappointed in their results when they proceed in the common way. For they try to cure and restore sick and weak bodies by giving them large potions and broths, which still contain so many impurities and coarse dregs that very little pure substance, wherein the healing power lies, remains. And this little is so buried in poison that it has no strength against the disease. Nor can nature assist such remedies, for she is overpowered in this struggle, pressed on one side by the impurity of the remedy, and on the other by the cause of the disease. It is as if one should attempt to drive away corruption by corrupting and corruptive means, which is impossible. Rain never dries rivers, nor does fire extinguish a flame, nor yet does corruption cast out corruption. They also attempt to restore their patients' wasted strength with foods of easy digestion, which they think contain little impurity and are therefore not subject to corruption. But they do not consider that this method can do little for them. For even if their foods are of the choicest kind, they are still of little real benefit, because they contain no power or action capable of destroying or even lessening the causes of disease. They only prop up a miserable life, almost brought to ruin by weakness, without freeing the sufferer from death, unless nature of herself rises up to resist the deadly plots of her enemies, or the patient seeks help from some excellent medicine, prepared by some skillful artist to a state of supernatural purity and perfection. Being free from corruption, such a medicine may restore the original vigor and thereby uproot the cause of the sickness. For every true medicine ought to perform two operations: to purge away corruption, and to restore lost strength. And in these 2 points the whole foundation and art of medicine consists. Yet the smaller part of this art, purging, is almost the only part in use, while the more excellent part, restoration, is almost entirely lost or else neglected through laziness or greed. That this is so may be seen from the ordinary potions that are taken, which have no other effect than to loosen the belly or to purge away some excrement which has nothing to do with the disease. Or else, owing to bad preparation, bad prescribing, or unsuitable combining of simples, they cause excessive evacuations which destroy nature, already weak, and now made more so, both through emptiness, which she abhors above all things, and through the violent motion caused by such purges. Thus they more often bring about death rather than health. For nature can no more endure violent agitation than she can endure emptiness. She is exceedingly impatient of these two sworn enemies which so clearly attempt her ruin. For this reason, ordinary medicine seldom cures stubborn diseases by its usual compound remedies. And if, among many, any one patient recovers, this does not come from the pills, boluses, and potions themselves, but from the strength of nature, which is able to overcome the impure mass mixed with these remedies and to draw from them some part of the pure substance of use to her. Or else, it is because the poisonous quality of these excrementitious and corrupting things is thrown out by nature, who is so powerful that in expelling such poison she also, by attraction and sympathy, carries away with it some portion of the diseased humor that resembles it. Thus, a foreign remedy, by attacking the body, stirs up nature herself. Provoked and roused to resist this enemy, she expels it with violence and opposes whatever is contrary to her. Now if a medicine were always to be helpful and not hostile to nature, it ought first to be freed from its own poison, that is, from its excrementitious mass. Therefore, a physician should first choose such things as are suited to and in sympathy with the human body, and then free them from their impurities, or at least select those that contain within them the general virtue or innate purity. This purification cannot be achieved until the impure and harmful matter is separated and destroyed, and the pure part restored, which lay buried and suffocated beneath the excrements. But since it is not my profession to make medicines, I will not pursue this subject further, but return to the path from which I have briefly strayed. I say, then, that since there is no lower thing which is not tainted with poison, immersed in excrements, and buried in dregs that bring about its death and hinder the freedom and action of its true substance, nature is forced, as it were by necessity, to make use of separation. This separation is carried out by dividing the pure from the impure, the subtle from the gross, and the healing from the harmful. But because this wonderful agent, nature, works in darkness, laboring inside bodies by a secret digestion, she never goes beyond simple perfection, her power reaches no further. For this reason the elementary bodies, as they are in themselves, cannot reach the highest degree of their own properties, and so the bodies in which they are enclosed also fall short. Therefore the philosophers wisely try to separate the substance of things from their corrupt mass, and after this separation, following nature's own method, that is, by digestion and sublimation, to bring them to the highest purity, giving them a new form by regeneration, stripping away their former nature, qualities, and properties, and changing their impure bodies into spirits filled with purity, turning their moisture and cold into dryness and heat. And they do this not only in certain species or simples, but in the great body of the world itself, which is our universal spirit. For unless the universal nature of things be renewed, it is impossible to bring it into a state of incorruption. Regeneration, then, is the first fruit of separation. But just as a grain cannot of itself bring forth anything unless it first die and decay in the earth, so it is impossible that anything should be renewed or regenerated except by a preceding mortification. Mortification, then, is the first step toward separation, and the only path to that goal. As long as bodies remain in their old corruption and original state, separation cannot truly reach them unless putrefaction and mortification go before. Our Lord Jesus also taught this in a divine way when he said that, unless a man, like a grain of corn, dies, he cannot attain incorruptible life. Not that he meant incorruptible life is gained by bodily death alone, for then the impious and wicked, by dying, would gain blessedness along with the good and just. Rather, he meant that the old man must die, that is, that a person must mortify and separate from himself that old corruption which he drew from the seed of his first parents. This corruption is properly intemperance and excess, introduced by eating the forbidden fruit, whereby death entered the world. From that moment, man has never ceased to die, because afterward the earth and all it produced were infected by the poison of the deceitful serpent, concealed in our food, whose enticements led man into transgression and into eating fruit in which death was contained. This corrupting serpent is what I call Satan, who, creeping and continually going about the earth, mixes his poison with it and with all that it produces, animals, plants, and minerals, with the intention of infecting the world with his venom and gaining tyranny over man. From this intemperance and excess in diet there followed a privation of virtue. For vice is nothing but a neglect of what is just, and justice is a temperate desire and a continual advance toward the good. This intemperance and excess must therefore die in us, because it generates all kinds of sin and spurs us on to malice and impiety. Hence we are commanded to live soberly, to avoid gluttony and drunkenness, the true parents of all carnal lusts, and to fast often, in order to extinguish those inner flames that stir our senses and heat our blood into corruption. The anatomists of man know that man is twofold, one part heavenly and immortal, the other earthly and corruptible. The first is like a sojourner, the second like a prisoner. Here, however, a great question arises: how can the heavenly man, while buried in this putrid and corrupt carcass, preserve his essential purity? For it is clear that a liquor, however precious and excellent, will lose its flavor and scent if it is long contained in a foul vessel, and a man, however sound, is likely to be infected if he lives in a plague-ridden house. The heavenly man is in himself good and sincere, but as he is joined to the earthly man, to whom impurity and vice naturally cling, it is hard for him to remain without stain. The loss and damage of this essential purity undoubtedly comes from eating the forbidden fruit, or, to speak more plainly, from intemperance in food, seasoned with deadly and contagious corruption. For this reason, this intemperance and corruption must be mortified, so that the old destroyer of man may be restrained, and that, by newness of life, what was lost may be restored, making us like our heavenly Father in incorruption. Our Restorer, Jesus, has taught us two ways to regeneration, one by the water of baptism, the other by the fire of the Holy Ghost. Water washes away stains, and fire consumes and separates all impurity from the pure essence. Just as his precious blood, which is indeed true water, cleanses our sins and delivers us from that death which the mortal corruption of our earthly forefather brought in, so common water dissolves and washes away those excrementitious impurities that corrupt all substances. The fire of the Holy Spirit consumes and separates the excrementitious impurity of sins, and in the same way, ordinary fire removes the impurity of bodies. For this reason bodies must be mortified in order to be regenerated, and this mortification is that putrefaction and digestion which prepares them to receive separation. This spiritual mortification is worked in us when the Son of the Holy Spirit rises upon our hearts and warms our center, gradually consuming the corrupt affections of the old Adam. In the same manner, the chymical fire, reverberating its flame around the body to be purified, burns away and destroys whatever in it is of a foreign nature, more or less, according as its impurity resists separation. The separation itself is then accomplished by distillation. This, then, is the true method that nature follows in the regeneration of all things. No worthy effect can be obtained in medicine unless things have been regenerated by water and fire. After this second birth, these same things are most free in their powers and operations, whereas before, their living functions lay buried in an excrementitious mass. And although the kindly influences of heaven had bestowed much virtue upon them, they could not manifest it. So also a man, so long as he is confined in the impure prison of the old Adam, can produce no truly good and praiseworthy action. But before I proceed further in practically explaining these matters, I must return to the order I began. Having given the definition of separation, and declared of how many kinds it is, I must now show from what things these kinds of separation are made, and whence this separating power arises. I have already shown clearly that in all bodies there are two parts. One is excrement. The other substance. The one accidental, the other essential. For substance, considered in itself, is entirely pure and without corruption, while excrement is wholly impure, mixing itself with substance and overthrowing and defiling its purity. The generation and formation of substance have been sufficiently shown in the first 2 chapters of this book. It remains for me now to explain the nature and qualities of excrements. From the foregoing narrative I infer that nothing but excrements should be separated, assuming as certain that, among all passable things in this sublunary world, nothing is free from excrements. When God separated the parts of the world, he commanded that certain things should descend to the lowest region, as sharing in the grossness of the first matter, and that they should gather there together. From this feculent mass the earth was formed. Yet the earth does contain within it a portion of pure substance, though this is diffused through its thick density. After Phoebus, the sun, had slain the monstrous python swollen with poisonous humors, which was generated from the slime of the earth, that is, when the innate dryness had drunk up the superfluous moisture by the action of natural heat, the earth began to feel the operation of this substance enclosed within her breast. This substance is that spirituous matter which is never idle, but always occupied with generations and vivifications. It may very properly be called the earth, because the true and virtuous substance of the earth is that alone which, by its own corporification, generates all bodies according to their individual ideas, as I have set forth in this ode, from which I will borrow only what is necessary for my present purpose. The spirit, moving on the face of that first formless, shapeless mass, encompassing it round about, caused the heavy from the light to part, and day from night to issue out. Then from the watery mass it made the heavier, colder, rounded frame, a globe well poised in equal weight, so that, well bound on every side, it cannot fall nor slip from place, while water, air, each in its sphere, do counterpoise and hold it fast. Then, pouring soul and seeds within, it made her nurse and mother be of heaven's fires and all earth's brood. Seeing, then, that in this universal separation whatever is more fiery and subtle chose the higher seat, and whatever is gross and heavy the lower, it follows that the heavenly bodies are immortal, being most distant and separate from all foul dregs. They are bent or hollowed into a round form because they rose all at once, and for this reason, too, nature assigns a round figure to eternal things, as being most perfect and least subject to decay. On the other hand, it follows that earthly things are exposed to corruption and death, because their composition unites contrary elements and contrary qualities, to which are added the impurities or dregs of the first matter. That first matter was not created purely, as some imagine, for then everything that proceeded from it would also be immortal, and indeed there would have been no generation in the world at all. Without contrariety of qualities and impurities, there would be no alteration, no change of forms, all things would have had one and the same face, without distinction. Everything would have remained equally pure and subtle and therefore without ornament or variety. To speak plainly, there would have been neither matter nor world created. It was therefore necessary that the subtle substance be mingled with gross dregs. Where there is nothing but pure, there is no action, because there can be no action without some passive subject, and what is purely simple has no power over what is equally pure, nor the impure over what is equally impure. Nature, however, is always at work separating the pure from the impure, in order to preserve its essence and its vital increase. For this it takes as its subject a substance mingled with impurity, which retains the state and condition of its first creation and is not nourished, multiplied, or increased except by the nutrition, multiplication, and growth of excrements. These are not consubstantial with it, but only companions and sisters of its birth. That things are so has been experienced by those who, through divine inspiration, have discovered a way to extract this first matter and to give it a body in imitation of nature. Whatever purity, cleanness, and brightness it seems to show, it is nevertheless always burdened with a great quantity of earthly dregs, which cannot be removed without great industry. I think I have now, by strong arguments, shown that no massy body is nourished and preserved by the visible earth, but only by a spirituous matter, and that therefore bodies abound greatly with excrements, and that their whole bulk is nothing but excrement, in which this spirituous matter, ready for corporification, lies hidden invisibly. For even though we eat and drink, almost all that enters our stomach goes out again in almost the same quantity. We do not draw our vital oil from that gross bulk, but only that pure essence and substance which lies concealed within it. In short, this excrementitious part is nothing else but the house of this pure substance and the vehicle that carries this nutritive spirit to the place of distribution, there to complete its digestion and necessary separation. Are not trees and plants incorporated with this mass of excrements? And is not that mass the conduit of their enlivening and vegetative spirit, and as it were the support that causes them to grow? I do not say that everything found within a tree or individual thing is purely excrement, for in each thing there dwells some small portion of this substance, which I cannot properly call a body, but rather a thing apt for corporification, which nature alone cannot bring into open view. For although all that we see and touch is born from matter fit to be made into a body, that visible body is not the substance itself, but merely excrement. Nature lets nothing of the true vital essence or substance appear, only art, by its industry surpassing the bare power of nature, can reveal it. A wise natural philosopher considers that, although the spirituous matter and substance of things is nowhere pure in natural creation but always mixed with dregs, it can be separated in a similar way to the digestion in the stomach, which rejects excrements and retains substance. Not that this separation is visible to the eye, but it is recognized by the understanding through its effect, because we see that dregs and excrements are cast out as unfit to preserve the essence of the body. Moreover, increase, restoration, and vivifying come into bodies by means of this inner substance. These effects themselves confirm its existence, even though nature hides the manner of its working. Since this substance can be separated out, it must be inwardly pure and uniform, homogeneous, in all its parts. Yet this purity cannot be fully manifested by nature in her ordinary operations, because the perfection she aims at in things is only a simple and basic one. But an artist, the true philosopher, observing that heat is the only medium and instrument which nature uses to reach that degree of perfection, and that fire is the only true purifier and separator, tending toward complete purification, and further considering that in the center of every body some pure substance is contained, which can be naturally separated, if not perfectly, yet as far as our powers allow, sets before himself the same method that nature uses, namely, fire. He administers it in such a way that it destroys, burns, or separates the excrements, without destroying the pure substance that resides in the center. He continues this work until that substance is perfectly pure, and fire no longer has power to destroy it, but instead acts to preserve it, exalt it, and imprint on it a tincture and quality like itself, so that finally the whole of this pure substance is converted into its own proper nature. The artist, then, noticing that this pure substance exists within all things, and that all things can be burned, and that after burning ashes always remain which the fire cannot consume, prudently concludes that in those ashes something remains that is not subject to the full power of fire and flame. Going on with his work, he finds a certain kind of salt, not produced by the fire, but rather victorious over the fire, like the pure gold that remains after a body is burnt. This salt is the last matter that remains in the dissection, anatomy, of bodies, not the ashes themselves, but that from which the salt is finally extracted, and from which nothing further can be drawn. For if by moisture it is dissolved into a water, heat will once again coagulate it into salt. From this we may conclude that this water is the mercury from which all bodies were first created, and that this water, hidden in the ashes, hinders their total consumption by fire, just as the universal mercury in the bowels of the earth, before the production of bodies, restrained total destruction there. For this reason the learned Rhonelauskas in his writings calls it, the water of mercurial fire, because fire generates it, nourishes it, and even increases its goodness, the longer it remains in the fire. The final operation of fire is to make salt, and salt is nothing but dry water, which acquires and keeps its dryness by means of fire, and therefore is of a nature very like to fire itself. And here I would not have anyone puzzled that, at the beginning of this book, I said that fire is not without moisture, for since it is nourished by moisture, it must also partake of moisture, because all things draw their nourishment from that out of which they are made. Thus fire and moisture are as it were two correlates, neither can be conceived without the other, not even in imagination. The elements undoubtedly have such affinity and connection with one another, and so partake of each other, that each element may be found in its companion. Earth contains air, water, and fire, water contains fire, air, and earth, air contains earth, water, and fire contains water, air, and earth. Without this mutual participation there could be no mutual conversion of elements, and no sympathy or agreement among them. From all that has been said we may gather that nothing is entirely free from excrements, and that excrement and substance are the two constituent parts of every body, and that only the excrement, being accidental and not akin to the essence or substance, ought to be separated. We may likewise conclude that fire alone accomplishes and facilitates this separation. It is now time to explain how this is done. For it is not enough to say that separation is the beginning of the works of nature and art, nor enough to know what things are separable, unless the practice and manner of this operation are also made clear. I said earlier that there are two kinds of separation. One is for distinction and ornament, which belongs to nature alone, not to art, and of that I will say no more. The other is separation by division, which I shall now explain. I said before that all things consist of two parts, excrement and substance. Substance is in itself simple and indivisible, whether we regard it generally as the first universal matter, or in particular as the first matter of any species, according to the impression of the celestial idea, which is infinite in variety. This substance, or first matter, in every species of compounded body, is one in essence, power, and quality. In one and the same subject, one part of the substance cannot be of one species and another part of another, but the case is otherwise with excrements. To make this clearer, I lay down this rule: there are only two means or instruments by which all separations are completed, fire and water. And there are only two things separable in bodies: one is separated by fire, the other by water. First, it is beyond doubt that the nature of fire is such that it destroys and consumes everything combustible, and that the nature of water is to wash and cleanse every substance from the filth that stains it. Fire devours everything that is volatile and airy, because that is its proper nourishment. Water removes, loosens, and carries away what is earthy and gross. So dregs and adustion are the two authors of corruption, and the main hindrances to the vigorous action of the substantial principle in all things. If we want proof of this, the bad smell of digestion and of excrements is argument enough, for the stench that we sense in burned things is a sign that little good remains there. The same is evident in the fumes of decaying or rotting substances, for such unpleasant odors show corruption. And beyond the corruption they produce, they bring two further inconveniences. They hinder penetration, and they hinder fixation. Yet these two actions, penetration and fixation, are absolutely necessary for the preservation of life. For whatever nourishes and supports life must be subtle, so that its fine parts may penetrate the body and, like a secret balsam, strengthen and augment the light of life in the center of the body. If it were gross and thick, it would rather obstruct, smother, and extinguish life, than penetrate through such narrow passages. On the other hand, since it preserves life in its state, it must also be stable, not wholly volatile, for if it were purely volatile, we would always be at the brink of death, lest it should be driven off by the corruption created by burnt, feculent matter, which constantly lays snares for our life. Thus grossness hinders ingress, and adustion hinders stability. From this we may take a solid warning for medicine: every true medicament taken inwardly, which is intended both to restore strength and to drive away the cause of approaching death, ought to have two properties. It must be able to pierce to the center of health, and it must be able to preserve that center, by spreading and carrying it through the whole body. The ancients once practiced this with good success, and not many years ago, the much-hated Paracelsus revived their operations for posterity, which had long been kept secret. Let who will deny it, I do not hesitate to affirm, that nothing can be brought to purity and stability without the operation of fire. These two qualities, purity and stability, must be chiefly attended to in preparing medicines. What leads me to this conclusion is this: no body in its first natural form can truly be medicinal, since it is immersed in the corruption of its excrementitious dregs. For such a body cannot reach the seat and sphere of health, nor preserve health once obtained, because it lacks the subtlety needed for penetration, and the fixedness needed to restore what is corrupted and to conserve what has been restored. This cannot be achieved by the common methods of preparation, neither in the substance itself nor by simple infusion. The impossibility of doing it in the crude substance shows itself in this: such crude medicines do not purge without violence, which brings more danger and weakness than true restoration. As for infusions, they can extract from simples only a bit of their external strength, that is, only that intensity which all bodies have naturally, mixed with a little of their excrementitious matter. Infusion does not draw out the inner virtue, but only the external flavor and superficial quality, whereas the true center of their virtue is quite different from what appears in their surface. We can see this by experience. Almost all infusions are bitter, which we are then forced to sweeten with sugar or honey, and most apothecaries are not industrious enough to extract the natural sweetness, in which the true nature of the thing lies, from the substances they infuse. All bitterness comes from salt, and salt has sweetness at its root. That inner sweetness can never be extracted by simple infusion in water, but only by fire and skillful art. That very sweetness is the true perfection of the medicine. Hence Arnold of Villanova says that if you know how to sweeten what is bitter, you possess the whole mystery. Nor was Brusescus ignorant of this, as appears by his dialogue entitled Demogorgon. Yet this hidden sweetness can never be brought into open view unless it is completely freed from earthly excrements and from volatile, airy adustion. The earthy part of a compound gives it a foreign taste, arising from the excrements of salt. From the variety of these salts, according to species and place of origin, arise the great diversity of flavors. For all taste comes from salt, and the more salt there is, the more intense the flavor. On the other side, that which is volatile and airy produces bad and unnatural odors, a stench, which we especially perceive when things burn, because of the combustion and inflammation of unctuous sulfur. That volatile part is clearly an excrement, as its stinking fumes show. The smoke that arises adheres to chimneys and other surfaces, which afterwards retain the smell of the burned bodies and the bitterness of the excremental salt. This is further proved by the blackness and darkness which this smoke impresses on everything it touches. Such blackening greatly hinders the light and splendor of nature, which always desires purity and freedom from obscurity, as we see in the intense brilliance of perfect bodies, a sign of their purity, in contrast with the dullness of those more immersed in impurity, such as imperfect metals and common stones, compared to perfect metals and precious gems. If we want to avoid long wanderings and, as the oracle advises, end our curious journeys within ourselves by searching out the causes of our diseases, we will easily find that they come from those corrupted fumes which darken the light of our health. From these we can take a clear outward sign of what is happening inside us. For a healthy person, because of the inward brightness and soundness of their natural disposition, has a clear, lively color in the face. But a sick person, from the very onset of illness, becomes pale and leaden-colored, their native strength and brightness decline and perish. All these changes come from sulphureous fumes and excrementitious, burnt, adust, vapors and inflammations, which spread through all the members of the body and, by passing through the pores, infect the whole frame. This paleness may also arise because nature, feeling herself burdened with disease, draws all the good and pure blood inward, gathering her forces so she may better resist the enemy and withstand his assaults. On that account the outer parts are left without their usual brightness. In this inner battle, the outer parts are as if dead and like earth, tending toward darkness, for earth, where this battle is fought, is naturally black, whereas fire is by nature clear and bright. The earth, being dense and dark, produces blackness, and sulphureous, sooty, smoky burning, adustion, produces obscurity, both thus cause corruption, destruction, and ruin. And apart from these two, earthiness and adustion, there is nothing in the world that brings about universal decay. No lower, sublunary, body is free from these evils except gold and precious stones, which nature has brought up to as high a perfection as she is able. Therefore death is the perpetual enemy of all other bodies, continually seeking to destroy them, but nature, like a careful mother, is always seeking to preserve her works. To aid them and withstand the fury of their adversary, she has armed them with two swift and powerful champions. Fire, which overcomes sulfurous burning, adustion, and water, which drives out earthy dregs. And just as nature is subtle and ingenious in all her operations, so art is endowed with equal subtlety and industry when it imitates her. There is no other general method of separation, established by nature from the beginning, than these two, fire and water, and nature has walked this path from the very youth of the universe. At the start of all things, when the first seeds of the world were without form and lay mixed together in chaos, they were dissolved in water, and by the Spirit of God, the first mover, who moved upon them, they were divided and distinguished. From this came the separation of light from darkness, the distinction of formed things from confusion, generation from barrenness, life from death. If, in that first mixture, all things had remained confused, pure with impure, excrement with substance, earth with heaven, life with death, then everything would have remained inactive, powerless, without true being or life, and the whole confusion would have been useless. The artist, true philosopher, thinking on this and seeing that nothing can exert its proper power until the mixture of pure and impure is separated, takes water and fire as his helpers and follows nature's pattern. He should very carefully observe her operations, especially in the generation of metals, for metals are more perfect the more they have been digested in the bowels of the earth. Thus this statement is unbreakable: water and fire are the only universal and principal means of separation. But because the composition of things varies, and one substance yields more readily than another, we must also act upon them in various ways, while still not turning aside from the plain path nature has drawn. For example, adustion, burnt, sulfurous residue, and unctuous sulfur, which make a body combustible and infectious, may be extracted from one kind of body in one way. Earthy filth and dregs must be drawn off in another way from other bodies. To this end were invented the classic operations: calcination and sublimation, to purge away adustion; distillation and dissolution, to remove earthy feculency; dissension, to preserve weak, easily combustible bodies. All of these are carried out either by fire, as in calcination, sublimation, and dissension, or by water, as in distillation and dissolution. But because both ancient and modern writers have already spoken at length about these processes, I will not labor further in explaining them, since I can add nothing new, nor any great ornament or ease to what is already written. It shall suffice if I add something definite and based on my own experience in general. Calcination, I say, was invented in order to overcome hard and stubborn things whose compactness and strong composition resist division and block easy separation. From calcination 4 advantages arise: the burning off of impure and stinking sulfur, the easier removal of superfluous and foreign earthiness, the fixing of the internal sulfur, the radical sulfur, and a more ready dissolution afterwards. For it is in the nature of fire to consume those parts that are burnable and not essential to the substance itself, to make it easier to separate and reject earthy excrements, to fix the radical sulfur, and to multiply salt within bodies, which salt alone will afterwards accept solution in water. I therefore say that calcination belongs only to bodies which, because of their strong continuity and hardness, hardly yield to treatment. Spirits and volatile things, which flee away in the fire, cannot be calcined unless some fixing substance is added to hold them, and that is against their nature. Since the only aim of calcination is to extract salts, in which the better part and the secret virtue of bodies resides, and to which the corrupt, burnt portion clings, which in sublimation we let evaporate and fly off as useless, this is so that the remaining substance may be more fully freed from earthly dregs and more easily brought by fire to purity and stability. It is true that sublimation also needs a stronger fire, especially when the materials to be sublimed are deeply mixed with the dregs of some other fixed body, so that these dregs cling more stubbornly. This kind of sublimation is the most secure, except in those subjects whose impurities are naturally very fixed. Dissension has a twofold use: to extract oil from vegetables without burning them, to cleanse fusible bodies, like metals, before they are made volatile. These are the three kinds of separation made by fire. Now we shall speak briefly of the other two, distillation and dissolution, which are made by water. The first, distillation, is done by inclination and straining, so that the clear part of bodies is drawn off with the water, into a distilled water of vegetables. For that type of distillation which is done by an alembic, vapor rising and condensing above, properly belongs to the order of sublimation, which is performed by elevation, not by washing. And though some consider this straining distillation minor and indifferent method, I say it should not be rejected, but rather highly valued, as being the principal method nature herself uses in her operations, and the one she sets as the only means for separating earthy impurity. By this same kind of watery distillation many things are raised up and brought to the height of their perfection, being in a hidden way elevated and refined to their purity. Some philosophers have therefore called it a secret sublimation. The second water operation, dissolution, is carried out by moist and gentle heat, for example by the warmth of horse dung, a St. Mary's bath, a kind of mild water bath, the steam of boiling water, simple infusion in water, or inhumation, burying, in a moist place. The goal of all these is the same, namely, to reduce calcined things back into a water, so that by this liquefaction the earthy matter may settle to the bottom of the vessel and be removed by pouring off or filtering. But this subtle process, and others like it, must be repeated many times. If anyone tries, by continuous calcination alone, to separate the more simple parts of a compound and to reduce to salt whatever has the nature of salt, he will suffer great loss. The excessive and continual violence of fire will sublime and carry off a large part of that which is being sought with such labor, so that only a small amount of soluble matter remains, along with a great heap of dregs. Moreover, that soluble matter may, by long staying in the fire, be turned into glass. It is therefore better to rely on frequent repetitions than to violate nature by excessive haste and too harsh a fire. I myself once met such an inconvenience in calcining common crystal. Wanting to purge it of its excrements and, by long heating, to bring it back to its true essence, I found that both the crystal and its excrements were turned entirely into glass, and thus made useless for my purpose. For though crystal is clear, bright, and transparent, yet in calcination it first gives off black fumes, then violet-colored fumes, and stinking sulphureous vapors, clear signs of its earthy excrements. After these come white fumes, which reveal the true homogeneous substance that remains, clear and fluid in small quantity, until it becomes a true crystalline salt. By repeating these last calcinations long enough, its unpleasant smell is changed into a most delicate fragrance, like violet powder. By these repeated calcinations a further two advantages arise. The thing calcined, being gradually accustomed to fire, gives stability and subtlety to medicines, as I said earlier. A body that has been often dissolved gains easy penetration and ready entrance into the human body, as well as a much stronger power to change the patient's state, from sickness to health, from weakness to vigor, from decline to full restoration and perfect health. These, then, are the ordinary ways of separation. They have no other aim than to purge pure substances from their excrements, and to raise their earthly grossness up to a fiery purity. That is, to lead them from imperfection to perfection. This is what Hermes hints at when he says that one must separate the earth by fire and the subtle from the gross, and that this must be done with great care and attention. For when he speaks of the preparation of the universal spirit after its terrification, its conversion into earth, and opens the way for the preparation of all individual things, he means that there is something in this earth which is very hard to retain and preserve, namely, a light and volatile spirit which can be held only by a well-tempered fire. But, on the other hand, this volatile spirit will very easily fly off together with the other separable, more abundant volatile part, unless in the work we use a moderate fire, follow a good method, and proceed with much patience. Here the artist must observe, with the greatest care, this rule. There are three distinct kinds of sulfur. Two are separable. The external sulfur, which is destroyed by calcination and dissolution. The internal sulfur, which disappears only by long decoction. And the third is fixed, which is properly nature's sulfur, the proper subject of the substance itself. This the philosophers call the agent, the fixed grain, or the element of fire. The external sulfur is that first volatile and combustible watery part. It is plainly foreign to the true substance and is the first food of fire. The internal sulfur is more deeply rooted in, and united with, the substance, and therefore does not give way except to strong and continued heat. As it goes out, it shows all colors in turn. First black, which is the primary sign of earthiness, burning, and corruption, and the forerunner of putrefaction and decay. Then it passes through various intermediate colors, until at last it takes on whiteness, which is an airy color, and then rises to a fiery color, or redness, in which state the power of art and the dominion of fire come to an end, and beyond which there is no further progress. The poets hid this truth under the fable of Proteus, who changed himself into many monstrous shapes to frighten those who tried to capture him. This succession of colors comes from the internal sulfur, the true author and producer of all tinctures and variations which nature or art shows in any subject. These colors can also be clearly observed in the cooking, decoction, of the first universal subject, as I mentioned earlier, when I said that I observed them in my own operations. There, whiteness appears first. Then nature's sulfur shows itself, that sulfur which Geber says is white on the outside and red within, for redness follows immediately after this whiteness, needing no other help than the continuation and increase of fire. Hence one philosopher said that his stone was a gold ring covered with silver. I wanted to add these few words about colors, not because I dare to teach the full preparation and all the observations necessary to perfect the great and so highly praised philosopher's elixir, but only to show the more curious disciples of learned Medea, those who, driven by deep and subtle inquiry, seek entrance into the secrets of these mysterious natural sciences, which sulfurs must be rejected and which must be kept in all operations. I will think my time well spent, taken away as it is from my household affairs, if I can restore any strength or spark of life to that fading branch of natural philosophy which envious men have buried in the tomb of slander under the hateful label of abusive transmutation and falsifying of metals. Their ignorance alone blinds them so they cannot see this true mystery, which they overwhelm with abusive and injurious words, basing their malice solely on the lying boasts of shameless dullards, fellows who run through the cities selling smoke, hiding their false tricks under the cloak of this fair virgin, and deceiving the eyes of the overly credulous public with paints and colorings. By their sweet but deceitful speeches, like sirens, they plunge curious seekers into Scylla or Charybdis. Chapter 4. Of the Spirit's ascent into heaven, and descent into the earth. The Almighty Creator of all things, foreseeing from the beginning that infection and corruption would grow in all things composed of body and spirit, and that they would stir up continual inward wars, opposed a remedy to this conflict, so that the one, the spirit, might be preserved without the other, the body, being utterly destroyed. Because spirit and substance, or soul and matter, are enclosed in a body, and that body is plunged into corruption, it was impossible that corruption should act upon and conquer the body without the spirit, which is present in both, also being endangered. Rather, it seemed inevitable that the spirit would, together with the body, fall under the tyranny of death, which always seeks nature's destruction and the ruin of all individual things. This needs no proof, it is plainly seen in the natural, and sometimes premature, end of animals, plants, and minerals, whose daily corruption we witness. When the body is dead, the spirit must share the same fate, that is, the vital power that animated the body disappears. But because the Supreme Maker wished to be admirable in all his works, out of his pure goodness and love toward mankind, whom from the beginning he predestined to be the instrument of his glory, and to whom he subjected whatever is most admirable in creation, he provided certain fitting remedies for man's benefit. By these remedies man might not only purify and perfect created things, but also guard and arm himself against the assaults of mortal corruption. God knew that the two parts of man were created one within the other, the spirit within the body, and that the body would continually be infected by corruption, and drawn by sensual desires into intemperance, which brings about the true corruption and weakening of all the members. He foresaw that the spirit, living as a guest within the body, could not remain untouched by its contagious depravity. We see this every day. People given over to excess and sensuality contract corrupt habits. They freely plunge into all kinds of corruption in mind and spirit, caring neither for the love nor fear of God, nor honor towards the world, nor piety towards themselves, nor charity toward their neighbors. It is therefore impossible that, if they remain so bound in filth unto death, their spirits should not suffer punishment, seeing they have shared in the pleasures. Since all mankind, through the fall of our first parent, is made subject to death, and each person must inevitably run toward destruction and ruin, God has softened, or rather repaired, this misery by an astonishing remedy beyond our full understanding. Knowing that man, by his spirit and by his body, participates in both heaven and earth, he prepared a remedy that is likewise of both heavenly and earthly nature. This remedy belongs only to our Lord and Redeemer Jesus Christ, who came down from heaven to earth and, by a mystery beyond our grasp, was made man without relinquishing his divine nature. Our healing could not come from earth alone, where corruption reigns. It was necessary that the water of healing should come from above, where the fountain of purity is. Therefore he descended, that he might dwell in us and with us, and set bounds to us by justice and temperance, regenerating us to newness of life through a change of our spirit and body, killing in us our corruptions and sins, and restoring us to the pursuit of pure virtue. None but he, who is the meeting point of both natures, God and man, could do this, so as to unite superior things with inferior, which were separated by the immense distance between life and death, purity and corruption. The earth indeed received this priceless treasure, far beyond all its deserts, by a means we cannot comprehend. From here he again ascended into heaven, by the water of purification and the fire of the Spirit, without suffering accidents and bodily passions any more, although he did not set aside his body, but retained it incorruptible and glorious, having obtained immortality through death. From there he shall again descend, from the right hand of the Father, to the earth, after the universal conflagration, to renew the world and to make a separation between the good, who are destined to life, and the wicked, who are condemned to death. See then how wisely the omnipotent Father, the Father of mercies, has provided for man. To this body joined with a soul, he has given an equal preserver, whom he sent from heaven to be born upon earth, and whom, by the light of nature, we ought to seek. Man was endowed with reason and judgment so that he might recognize and understand such great gifts. Yet man, who was created heavenly in order to search out this benefit, forgetful of his noble birth, spends that noble and divine light within him in chasing frivolous and fleeting vanities, and not in the pursuit of solid wisdom and truth. In short, he prefers to follow the inclination of his earthly origin, rather than divine and heavenly wisdom, which he neglects as though it were a thing indifferent and casually thrown down to him from above. Therefore the root of mankind is, as it were, extinguished before it springs forth, except in a few whose birth has been favored with better stars and more benign aspects at their nativity. Most men prefer the possession of transitory goods over the attainment of the divine and precious gifts which our fruitful Mother Nature has openly and everywhere fixed for the preservation of life, yet a life rather harmed than helped by the abundance of her treasures, which are immersed in mortal corruption. It is clear that those of loftier spirit, although they see the brilliance and splendor of worldly riches and do not wholly despise them, nevertheless do not rest in that outer glitter. They look beyond it and seek the divine virtue hidden in the center. This very search, however, has been the cause of many errors in both medicine and philosophy, in those who, lacking true light, grope in the dark and pass by both truth and remedy. Recalling my mind, then, to that clear light by whose guidance we may reach the saving and best remedy which God ordained especially for the preservation of mankind and the obtaining of heavenly blessing, I will endeavor, with all humility and due sincerity, not as a theologian, but as a disciple of those who follow wisdom, to sketch out my thoughts in a plain and simple style. Let the lovers of truth accept them thankfully, if they find them reasonable and fitting. I say, then, that all understanding a man receives from man alone is uncertain and confused, because man is ordinarily burdened with ignorance and slow decisions. But the understanding he receives from the universal light is clear and unshakable. For to know something absolutely is to understand it by its first causes, and there is no certainty in second causes until we reach their origin. Therefore we cannot know the nature of a species unless we first know its genus. Likewise, we cannot know the nature of the microcosms, which are almost infinite, unless we first discover the nature of the macrocosm that gives them being. Man also cannot be known without first knowing the world of which he is the image, nor can the great world be known unless we know whence and how it was made. For how shall one know a man whose beginning is nothing but a small, shapeless bit of slime? Or how shall a man know the one who is born, unless he knows those who begot him? And here I do not mean the secondary parents, but the first parents, namely heaven and earth. And unless a man understands the first creation of these, how shall he truly know them? Just as an embryo in the womb is at first nothing but a gathering of a certain moisture, which is afterwards formed according to the example of its parents, and then proceeds, step by step, until it becomes complete, so heaven, earth, and all that is in them, that is, this whole great world, were like an embryo in the chaos, from which no one can gain any light unless he considers the first beginnings and the progress of its separation and formation. Let us therefore go first to the fountain and spring, so that from there we may trace the streams that flow from it and know them, and by the examples of forms judge of the things formed. I say, therefore, that the prime and absolute Creator, who is as a point from which all things proceed, and as an inexhaustible fountain from which infinite streams issue, has a nature proper and peculiar to himself, namely, to preserve as well as to produce the whole world. It is the property of a good author not only to bring things into being, but, once he has produced them, to preserve and defend them. The first of his effects, creation, is a secret of which we are ignorant, we understand it only by its resemblance to generation. But the second, preservation and governance, is open and manifest, at least to those who are enlightened, chosen, and born of the Spirit, though not to the children of the flesh, so that precious pearls may not be cast down and trampled underfoot by swine. Our Lord Jesus Christ has perfected that former and more excellent work, and has taught us, commanding us to imitate him in all good works, of which he has given us an example. For nature always walks in the same path, and never abandons her ways. Just as the universal Father and Preserver, by his providence, from the beginning consulted the common preservation of all things, so nature, from the beginning, has had her own intentions and is always occupied in continual action about productions. And just as it was necessary that the safety of man's spiritual part should descend from above, so it is likewise necessary that the safety of the body should come from the same fountain. For from below, where the seat and dwelling place of corruption is, neither life nor safety can proceed. For what purpose do the heavens, that perpetual fountain of restoration and perfection, pour forth the influence of their powers upon the body of the earth? What do the benevolent stars, with their kind aspects, intend, as they daily show favor to the distressed fellowship of mankind, except to generate in the earth a durable and life-giving spirit? In the womb of this fruitful mother, that spirit assumes a body, and spreads and unfolds its powers through all the parts of the world, distributing them to each creature according to its need. On these derived powers depend the particular virtues which we must learn to know by their effects in herbs, animals, stones, and other things which have drawn their properties from this general spirit, and which, in a marvelous way, preserve us and other creatures. And just as it pleased God to enrich man with the perfection of his own Son, according to the measure of human nature, and yet he did not wish anyone stained with sins and iniquities to seek remedy and salvation from man, but from himself, the true fountain from which all perfection flows, so also nature, the faithful observer of the divine will and imitator of his works, has not fixed the perfect healing power in herbs and particular creatures, but has willed that we seek it precisely in the center from which it is communicated to those creatures, that is, in the earth, where this enlivening spirit is generated. For if simple substances, simples, are endowed with power to heal, restore, nourish, and preserve, how much more must that abundant dispenser possess of it, from whom they all receive it? And that the earth is the storehouse and dispenser of these powers, daily experience gives us sufficient proof. She must possess them, or else she could not bestow them. It is therefore remarkable that so many distinguished men should spend their time drawing their waters from little side streams, far removed from their pure fountain and running through a muddy channel, instead of going straight to the fountainhead. I do not, meanwhile, despise special medicines. I only wish that general remedies were more sought, and the particular ones not neglected. For although a universal medicine might cure every disease, yet particular medicines deserve praise, especially in external, superficial ailments, when the center of health is not afflicted. Returning now to my main point, I say again, the earth is the matrix in which the heavens beget that spirit, that nourisher, restorer, and preserver of bodies, which alone gives solidity and a perfect cure. How such a potent and efficacious spirit is to be discovered and obtained is the question to which all wise men should direct their thoughts. They ought to observe the exemplar steps which nature takes in perfecting her intentions and hold fast to this rule: although God, infinitely surpassing nature, is not bound to natural reason, any more than a monarch is bound to the laws he himself lays down, yet his subjects observe those laws without inquiring why he made them. And who has followed this example more faithfully and successfully than Hermes Trismegistus? After the flood, he was, as some say, the first who opened to men the mysteries of the true knowledge of God and clearly explained nature's secrets. Besides speaking in a manner almost angelic in his Poimandras about divinity, where he sets forth the doctrine of the creation of the great and small world, its beginning, progress, and duration, he continues his holy philosophy in the same spirit in his Asclepius. There he declares, with a prophetic spirit and voice, that the regeneration of man would be accomplished through the mediation of the Son of God, invested with human flesh. He also aims at this same goal in his Tabula Smaragdina, Emerald Tablet, where he says that just as all things in the world were made out of one subject, through the mediation of one God, so his Magistery, that is, the chief and universal medicine, may be perfected and completed by adaptation alone. This adaptation is nothing else but a mirror, in which we can see divine workings represented in riddles, to show that nature necessarily follows the steps of her master. He also testifies in other books that the author of regeneration would descend from heaven and become man and live among men for their instruction. In his Tabula, which he left as the last testament and witness of the excellence of his thoughts, he says that this universal spirit, the preserver of bodies, shall descend from heaven, namely, from the sun and the moon, which in the Poimandras he calls the chief rulers in this worldly monarchy, to assume a body in the earth, which he calls the nurse of the spirit, and that this will be done by the mediation of the air, in whose belly it will be carried. For the celestial influences cannot be communicated to the earth unless the air, acting as an intermediary, carries them down. And just as the divine restorer and protector of our souls, in taking human flesh, laid aside nothing of his divinity, so likewise, says Hermes, the universal spirit will retain and keep all its power entire when it is turned into earth, that is, when it takes on a terrestrial body. God also willed that his own Son and our Redeemer, in his assumed humanity, should be, as it were, regenerated by the water of baptism and the fire of the Holy Spirit, not because he had any need of such cleansing, but because he was to live among men stained with corruption and was to set, in all things, an example of renewal and purification, giving men visible and ample proof that, according to the flesh, he was of the same nature as they, not contaminated or corrupted, but subject to suffering and equally mortal. In the same way, our fruitful Mother Nature willed that her firstborn, although pure in his center, should be regenerated by water and fire. That is, by separating the earthly part from the fiery, the dense from the subtle, and the impure from the pure. This is also what Hermes aimed at when he said that the earth must be separated from the fire. For what God has joined, man must not separate, but only divide the impure and gross from the subtle and pure, by means of fire. Besides this meaning, which readily presents itself to our understanding, there is yet another, more hidden sense. For since, by the separation of earth from fire, he intends the separation of the gross from the subtle, he seems to hint that we should separate the natural qualities of these two elements, taking away the moist cold mixed with heavy earthly things, without which that cold cannot subsist, and clothing them instead with hot dryness, which is of the nature of fire and therefore light and spiritual. For this reason he adds that the matter must ascend from earth to heaven, that is, from imperfection to perfection. Paracelsus calls fire the firmament. And just as nothing can reach perfection without first putting off its imperfect, gross, and mortal covering, in which cold abounds, the cause of all dying, while heat is the cause of life, so also prudent nature follows this rule, that each subject must endure and pass through the dark blackness of death, and then await the bright and shining renewal of life and immortality, that is, an impassible essence over which neither fire nor corruption have any power. Indeed, this gaining of life through death is something that all creatures naturally practice continually. All seed of animals is first mortified in some matrix, and that of plants in the earth, before any definite form can arise. But if this rule holds in the members, how much more carefully should we observe it, and directly imitate it, in the head? And if the life that is gained through mortification has any duration at all, how much more must that life be eternal which is principle? Jesus Christ taught these things through the parable of a grain of corn, which he says cannot bear fruit unless it first dies, thereby signifying the mystery of his resurrection, which his death had to precede. He willed to die so that he might rise again into a glorious and everlasting life. In this he not only gave an example to men, but expressed the whole pattern of nature. That divine and learned hermit Maurienus Romanus, who is often cited by modern and natural philosophers, affirms the same of the fixed grain to which nature has given the power to perfect metals. For he says, unless it putrefies and becomes black, it cannot be perfected and completed, but returns to nothing. I have taken the liberty to say this much so that I may teach younger readers how the Creator should be recognized through simple creatures. And because most people seek this knowledge from remote things, acting like those who go to the youngest pupils, instead of the best teachers and doctors, when they wish to learn the perfection of a science, I would stir them up, by these natural reflections, to turn the chief powers of their souls toward the search for the universal principle, and particularly in those more excellent things which impart life and preservation to all mortal creatures. Mortification, then, must necessarily come before every entrance into life, especially in the case of this spirit, the firstborn of nature, when it takes on a body. For otherwise no man could separate it from the body that hinders its regeneration into life and the pacification of its essence. Not that by burning and destruction it loses its body in death, nor yet by putrefaction, just as, in germination, the putrefaction of seeds does not annihilate that which has been embodied in them. For this reason, in the exaltation of Mercury, that is, of the universal spirit, after the first degree, which is accomplished by separation, everything that is corporeal and spiritual becomes volatile, because the sublimating power in it overcomes the fixing power. But afterwards the fixed part retains the volatile with itself, aided by the action of heat, which increases the power of the two nobler elements and destroys the power of the two weaker. Hermes hints at this in a certain treatise under the image of a winged bird held fast by a bird without wings, and Nicholas Flamel under the image of two dragons, one with wings and one without. But, so as not to entangle myself too long in these Daedalian labyrinths, do we not see all plants growing and lifting themselves upwards by the power of this volatile spirit? This spirit, as I said before, would carry them still higher toward the place from which it came, to which it has a natural desire, were it not detained by its own proper earth and bodily mass in which some fixed matter resides. However, lest some who are not sufficiently used to philosophical terms should think we contradict ourselves, I will explain myself here. I do not mean by this volatile spirit the same thing I previously called volatile and separable sulfur, for that is rather the author of corruption than of growth. I mean instead that most simple part of the primordial vapor, which never loses its subtlety, whose nature it is to be raised upward and to strive toward perfection. For, to sublimate, properly and philosophically, means nothing else than to perfect and exalt things from imperfection to perfection. So, just as this mercury has a part in it that can be raised, the volatile, so too it has a stable part. The first is naturally inherent in it, the second lies in its center or potentiality and cannot bring itself into effect without the help of art. And that I may show more clearly in what way nature proceeds in her operations, I think it proper to add a little here about the causes and manner of fixation. Repeating, then, that indubitable axiom I stated at the beginning of this book, as something always observed in the constitution of the world, namely, that everything which has life also has some duration, and that nothing produced under the heavens vault lacks some kind of life, I say that this duration must be achieved by conservation unto continuance. For perpetuation is nature's goal, since it is the aim of every good craftsman to preserve the work of his hands until it is corrupted by the injury of time, or the light of life in it is extinguished by the cold ashes of death, before whose feet all things must necessarily fall down, under that inevitable law, that whatever has a beginning must also have an end. For if all things were to remain in their first extreme, that is, in their beginning, without proceeding to the second extreme, that is, their death, then all things would still be left in their chaos, or rather, nothing would truly exist at all, and the principles of all things would be useless and destructive to themselves. Nature, therefore, to avoid these inconveniences, observes this order and progress in things, continual action and motion, namely, conservation and perpetuation. Now, that which extends life or preserves it cannot stand firm against the force of destruction without some kind of fixation and constancy. And this preserving essence is more fixed in some than in others, hence some things have a longer and more durable life and are harder to destroy and bring to death, like the stag and the crow among animals, the oak among plants, and gold among minerals. This comes from the more even and thoroughly digested mixture of the elements in them, so that death, whose property is to divide and separate, cannot so easily get into these compounds, which are tightly united and well digested. And the more firmly bodies are thus constituted, the less they are subject to the accidents of mortal corruption. But nature, not being able of herself to attain this full perfection of union and digestion, cannot totally and forever protect bodies from destruction. The industry of art, however, even though art of itself is nothing without nature, imitates nature in these actions and yet surpasses her in her own course, it being proper to her to refine that course. Observing that the conservation and prolongation of life can be reached by something that tends toward fixation, and that this must be achieved by union and digestion, for nothing can be fixed except what is homogeneous and of one nature, the artist works to discover what is capable of being fixed and to lead it to perfect fixation. He does this by the same ways, order, and operation that nature herself uses, namely, by separating what is extraneous and uniting what is homogeneous, and then completing this by a long and skillful digestion of the united things. Because it is impossible for him to separate or extract this from individual, specific bodies, on account of their stronger union and more compact digestion, he is compelled to seek it in the bowels of the earth, whence all things proceed. To extract it from some other place, entire and already fully endowed with power, would be useless and impossible, and to imagine how it might be made perfect there would be a labor both long and uncertain. Thus the poet has spoken well. Here, or nowhere, is that which we seek. Those are certainly deceived who, following crooked and side paths, cling only to the common meaning and outer bark of philosophical words, and do not strive to discover the living marrow of their intentions. They ought to sacrifice first to the infernal queen, for there is the fountain and spring of all things. The wise begin their work from the root, not from the branches. They choose, as Dr. Bacon says, to congeal that thing upon which nature first began her operations, by a proportioned mixture and union of pure living mercury with a like quantity of sulfur into one mass. O holy words! In them that good Englishman, or rather, angel, clearly painted out that one true matter of which all the philosophers have written volumes under various figures and riddling fables, not because they wished maliciously to hide it, but to keep the privilege of this knowledge for learned and devout men, who by continual study and laborious experience find and adorn it. Yet, lest I should give some masters cause to suspect that I quote this passage ignorantly or misunderstand it, I would have them know that by that matter which Bacon so ingeniously describes, I understand the universal spirit of which I am speaking. And likewise, that I distinguish between the Father and the Son, or the begetter and that which is begotten, or the producer and that which is produced. Nor need I be ashamed to say that I know the one as well as the other. For the philosopher, Bacon, wishes that those who search for the making of the philosopher's stone should look for the principle of minerals, and he sketches the first matter of metals, already prepared, compounded, and specified by nature. But I am treating of a first matter not yet specified, which may properly be called the first matter of this first matter of metals, the most general genus, so greatly celebrated by Raymond Lull. I used Bacon's sentence for example and authority's sake only, and in such a way that no contradiction lies in it, for the universal spirit is the common parent of mercury and sulfur, contained and proportioned by nature in this one philosophical subject. I would have the curious artist consider two things. First, that by subtle imagination he chooses a living nature suitable for the preservation of all bodies. Second, that he chooses a thing which of itself can give life and regenerate. Yet I would not have him choose, from two different and separate matters, one to be the agent and the other the patient, but rather one single thing that can at once both give life and receive life. As to active vivification, I have said enough. As to passive, I say that every principle has its origin from itself, for if it had it from elsewhere, it would not be a principle. And while it gives being to others, it must at the same time draw from itself restoration and perpetual fullness. Therefore it is in continual action and motion toward vivification, and by that movement its destruction is hindered, for it will never forsake itself. It has motion in itself and from itself, a point which Macrobius also argues in his commentary on the dream of Scipio, when he speaks of the human soul, though I think his discourse can be even more aptly applied to the soul or spirit of the world, which is my subject. I will therefore borrow this from his arguments: whatever is moved by itself is the beginning of motion, and lives continually, and that which lives continually cannot receive life from anything but itself, therefore it is capable of giving life. Now the spirit of the world is of this kind, because it has its seat in the earth, so as to turn itself into earth, and in that earth, as Hermes rightly says, all its powers, operations, and qualities remain entire. It follows also, since it is vital, that it takes life back again, restoring itself by its own proper power. We find the same thing in this universal Mercury, which is always nourished and renewed in its mine. So that if by any means it is drawn out, it continually grows again into the same form it had before, and wherever it is cast, there will always afterwards be plenty of it there. Not that it is generated from the earth, but that it is generated in the earth, through whose parts it creeps, stretching itself out continually by multiplication and growth. This the ancients represented as the serpent, which Moses says creeps upon the earth and feeds on its dust. And this made the Kabbalists call him, the Prince of Sepulchres, because he devours and consumes the bodies that are buried there, not that dead bodies or the soil are his food, but that they are the places where he is nourished and maintained. This is the region in which he is in constant motion, twisting and turning without rest. Medea warns Jason of this when she says, in Ovid's Heroids, that a sleepless dragon, horrible with rattling scales, hisses and with its twisted breast sweeps the ground. A French author expresses the same idea in these lines, paraphrased. Behold the watching dragon, full of witch-like rage. His body ringed with grinding, creaking scales. His gaping throat breathes smoke and fire abroad. And with his coiling folds he sweeps the earth, printing the dusty ground with endless winding furrows. I bring forward these two testimonies not only to show where and how Mercury must be sought, but also to confirm that that which is fixable in it is nothing else but the life-giving essence, which, being duly fixed, perpetuates and maintains life in all things it enters, by its purity driving out excrements, and by its perfection perfecting what is imperfect. The end of fixation, both natural and artificial, is perpetuation and preservation, and these are accomplished by means of that tincture which Mercury acquires through fixation. For this tincture is life, and life is nothing else but that which opens and colors the body with such a tint as shows it to be alive, and which perishes when the body dies. Nature therefore colors blood, in which life resides, with a red tincture. And when the blood is clearer and more vividly red, the body is healthier, more beautiful, and more vigorous. On the contrary, when the blood is thick, black, burned with choler, or turned into a false color, the body is inwardly afflicted and sick, and bears outward witness of this by its discoloration. We can see the same in plants, whose living strength is shown in their greenness. When that changes, we say they are declining and turning toward death. The perfection or imperfection of metals is likewise recognized by their colors. Gold is endowed with a magnetic power, which, through the bright radiance of its tincture, draws man's, earth, his bodily nature, after it. In it nature spends all her power, yet leaves the final victory to the industry of art, for art, by raising its natural splendor to a higher degree, makes it far more shining, so that it is called the terrestrial sun. An artist can exalt the golden color to the height of a deep, dark redness, and by this increase of tincture, imperfect metals, to a certain degree, can be brought, by projection of this artificial tincture, up to the height of perfection. Thus we see that this golden color, introduced by nature into this metal, is only the pathway to that redness in which the completion of perfect power lies. For this reason, although this metal far surpasses the rest, it can give no true perfection or lasting preservation to the human body, contrary to the promises of 1,000 jugglers and lazy men in physic, who with their sophistical meltings and fanciful preparations deceive people. But if more skillful artists work upon this subject, they can bring it to such a degree of inseparable redness that, by the excess of its heat, it will work wonders, and yet it will consume nothing but superfluities, while preserving and multiplying the substance of bodies. Philosophers say that its heat exceeds our ordinary fire as much as ordinary fire exceeds the innate heat in animals. Paracelsus, in his treatise of tinctures, highly praises that tincture which is extracted from gold by spirit of wine, and attributes many remarkable virtues to it, as also to that which is prepared from antimony and coral. Yet even before these, he seems to prefer the tincture of mercury, which, he says, can by perfect fixation be brought wholly into tincture, so that it will penetrate bodies thanks to its very subtle purity. I think here he does not mean vulgar mercury, but philosophical mercury, in which art, by perfecting nature, has produced these two effects together, complete tincture and complete fixation. Tincture, then, in its proper sense, is the pure substance of things, and body is nothing but an excrement. This is clear from the fact that when bodies have had their tincture separated from them, they remain useless, powerless, and corruptible, like a carcass without life, color, or motion. Tincture may therefore be called the goal of fixation. By its permanence in the fire, it gains a preserving force in the bodies to which it is applied. And the way to reach this degree of fixation, in which lies the completion of the whole work, is simply to keep light and fugitive things prudently in the fire, so as to accustom them to it until they can endure the most violent heat. For this reason good authors commend patience to their disciples as a gift from God, whereas haste and rashness they attribute to the devil. Take this for an infallible rule: unless calcination comes first, nothing can be fixed. This must be done by joining the fixable spirit to something of a suitable nature that can hold it in the fire of calcination, so that by this means it can be gradually trained to endure heat, until it is able to sustain the highest increase of fire, which brings fixation. And the reason we must proceed with such care is that if we rush this operation too quickly, that special spirituality which is the mother of the tincture will fly away and leave the body without any impression of coloring power. Then a new spirit must be supplied to this dead head before the desired color can be introduced, and that is one of the secrets of this chemical art. For it is the spirit, and nothing else, that colors by means of fire, and this tincture, once completed and exalted in our mercury, should be raised to the height of perfection, so that, as Hermes says, it may ascend into heaven. And after it has endured all mortal torments, it receives a new life, that is, after it has passed through the dark straits of putrefaction, it is lifted into a kind of resurrection by the removal of all deadly and corrupting accidents. Thus it reaches the summit of perfection, brought about by separating earth from fire, the subtle from the dense, and by fixing the purified part through gradual heat. To speak plainly and without evasions, this ascent into heaven, that is, the sublimation and exaltation of its parts to perfection, cannot be achieved unless separation and purification go before and make way for fixation, which is the goal and final end of art. And note this: it is done for two purposes. First, that the tincture may be made permanent. Second, that the volatile and combustible sulfur of mercury may be separated and removed, which can only happen through the long and continual action of fire. This fire must be regulated, lest too violent a heat at the beginning cause the pure spirit of mercury, not yet fixed, to ascend and escape. Comes Trevisanus hints at this when he says that writers differ about the ordering of the fire, though they all aim at one and the same end, that it should be so governed that the fugitive spirit does not flee away before that which pursues it has suffered anything from the fire, that is, that the spiritual part does not forsake the bodily part through the fierceness of the fire, but that the fire, applied in proper degrees, should fix it. In this discrete gradation of fire lies the whole of this art. But someone may say, if fixation in the fire gives lastingness to this penetrating subtlety, how shall it afterwards be sublimated? Let such a one, so to speak, take waxen wings, and he will see that he indeed has a desire to flee away from this prison, the earth. But he must take care that, in flying too high, the sun does not melt his wings and burn his feathers, casting him headlong into the sea. Rather, let him imitate wise Daedalus, who kept to the middle path between two extremes, for if he had flown too low, the water would have weighed down his wings, and if too high, the sun would have softened the wax. It was the impatience and blind ambition of Icarus, trying to outfly Daedalus, that caused his ruin. And where did Phaeton's deadly ruin come from, when he tried to drive the chariot of the sun, except from this, that he thought himself more fit for that task than his father? His father warned him in these words: "Follow the track you see marked by my wheels. So both sky and earth will bear the heat in equal measure. Neither press too low nor force your way too high in the upper ether. If you go too high, you will burn the constellations of heaven. If too low, you will scorch the earth. Safest of all is the path in the middle." These Ovidian verses are not enough by themselves, though they are entirely true according to the ancients. I would rather explain the meaning hidden inside the fable's clothing, since such stories are useful only to those who are already experienced in this art. Let the curious student understand this. When Hermes says that this thing must ascend into heaven and then descend again to earth, and take on the powers of both, he does not mean that the matter must literally be driven up to the top of the vessel. He means only this, that, after perfect fixation, a certain spiritual portion must be applied to it, by which it can be dissolved and made entirely spiritual, laying aside its earthly solidity and taking on an airy nature, which is the philosopher's heaven. And when it has been brought to this simplicity, it must then be coagulated again and reduced to earth, by a new cooking under the same degree of heat, until the body so embraces the spirit that they become one single, incorporated thing, thereby gaining both celestial subtlety and earthly fixation. And, if we are always to follow nature's methods, then if this Icarus of ours cannot fully lift himself up, he must refeather his wings with new wax and new feathers, that is, the work must undergo repeated dissolutions. The masters of the art repeat these dissolutions so often that they seem tedious to those who do not understand how necessary that repetition is. Its purpose is only this, that the things may be more perfectly united, being mingled down to their smallest particles. This cannot be achieved unless both body and spirit have first been purified. The spirit must be kept volatile and free from all earthly filth, and the body from all inward dregs, during the process of fixation. Thus the things ascend into heaven by dissolutions, and descend to earth by congelations, recoagulations. This glorified body will then ascend into heaven on the wings of its spirit, and in the same perfection descend again to the earth, to separate good from evil, preserving the one and destroying the other. That is, whatever bodies it enters, it expels their impurities and preserves their pure substance, for many repeated solutions and fixations have given it power to penetrate bodies. This is like the hermaphrodite youth and his delicate Salmachus. They must both be washed together in a fountain so that they can embrace. Then Salmachus, burning with love, cries, "When will the time come that this fair young man can never again be separated from me nor I from him, and that our mutual love may join us forever, so that these two bodies may have one heart and one face?" And then we must take care that the island Delos remains immovable, and that Apollo and Diana, whom Latona bore there, both remain fixed in that place. All this fable means nothing else but this, that the dissolved matter, in which the philosopher's sun and moon are contained, must again be congealed and fixed. I would not have my reader imagine that in this book he will find the rich mines of Peru to satisfy his greed and make him wealthy, though, to those who have eyes in their heads, I have made it clear in several places that the path to those riches is not unknown to me. Even so, I will not easily be persuaded to take so long a journey, for reasons not unlike those which held Trevisanus back for 2 years from the enterprise, even after he had gained perfect knowledge of this magistery. My only firm resolve is to confirm and bear witness to that most precious medicine, or rather inestimable treasure, which kind nature gives for the support and prolongation of human life, life that was granted by God the privilege of being under such a protector. I undertake this from an honorable desire to advance the common good by my industry. When the favorable star of experience has safely brought me into harbor, then I shall willingly share it with inquiring minds. For I have worked so successfully with this universal spirit that, by using only a small quantity, I have restored more than 100 men, wasted by various diseases, back to health. Without doubt, many fine minds would have penetrated much further into this dark and tangled forest, had they not been so terrified by the monsters they found there, and so confused that they turned back from this dangerous path and abandoned their attempt. This has been most ingeniously pictured by Polyphilus, whose noble and fearless courage, scorning those common terrors, achieved so much that both sides of this black and gloomy wood lay open to the light. Under his guidance one can, despite all obstacles, arrive safe and sound at the delightful and pleasing dwelling of Lady Polia, enclosed within the rich temple of Vesta. This much I can assert as unquestionable: the path he took is open to everyone, but not everyone has the thread of Ariadne that he possessed, to free himself from this labyrinth, nor is every man a Theseus capable of conquering the Minotaur. It is certain that nature, like a loving mother, offers and presents this precious treasure of life to all, and that God, our universal Father, keeps the gate of this fateful cavern open for the benefit of all men. The descent to hell is easy, but to climb back again to heaven, that is the labor, that is the task. As if to say to the coachman, "Stop, driver, here is the first straw of difficulty." First, then, that shining branch dedicated to the infernal Juno must be found, the golden bough, which Virgil describes. One cannot enter the hidden realms below until one has plucked that golden fruit from its tree, as a gift for fair Proserpina, and once that fruit is taken, another golden shoot instantly springs in its place. If nature herself is so careful to hide these things, lest they lie openly before everyone or pigs get their snouts into the honeypots, it is no wonder that ancient and modern philosophers have invented so many enigmatic figures and hidden fables to veil and clothe this science. They knew well enough that ceremonious nature would never have concealed herself under so many different forms and disguises, rather than appear naked, unless it were to prevent her venerable secrets from falling into the contempt that always follows what is cheap and common. For that reason I too, in this treatise, use the same solemn reserve and silence, lest I should incur the same danger as the man who made public the mysteries of the Eleusinian goddesses, mysteries that should have been kept secret and chaste, not displayed like common prostitutes for public abuse. Whether I have spoken suitably for my purpose or not, those who have made some progress in this search can better judge. Experience is the best teacher. Meanwhile I hope that no one will put a harsh interpretation on my words or pass a severe judgment on me because I have compared natural and chymical operations with divine and Christian mysteries, to which they bear some likeness. By this comparison I have in no way profaned those mysteries, rather, I have celebrated their excellence and pointed out the great care and witness of our Creator in confirming the safety of both body and soul together. This is what moved one writer to say that true chemistry, what Paracelsus calls spagyry, follows the gospel step by step, for by means of this art and of fire, nature exercises her most powerful faculties. The ancient philosophers, such as the Brahmins, the Gymnosophists, and all the Egyptians, hint at the same thing throughout their theology. All the magic of the pagans, and all the fables of the poets, mean nothing more than what this book is treating of. The most learned and subtle Brasescus examined this diligently, though the envious Tolatinus writes the contrary, after he was misled in an experiment in this art. He thought he had forced Brasescus to reveal his secret by much pressing and questioning, and was persuaded that the scum of iron was the philosopher's mercury, because Brasescus had said that the matter is drawn from something vile, of little price, that is thrown into the streets. He did not notice that the discreet masters of this art dress their matter in strange garments, and call it by all the names of the metals, without distinction, and yet do this without the least deceit. For whoever truly knows this matter also knows that it contains all 7 metals within it. And I would gladly know whether people really think that Cosmopolita was speaking of common steel, when he says that Neptune showed him, under one rock, 2 mines, one of gold, the other of steel. The man was far too straightforward to harbor such a foolish idea. He called his matter steel because of its likeness to polished steel. And Brasescus would have acted like a fool, and not a philosopher, if he had suddenly opened the whole secret at once, the secret on which, no doubt, he had spent 2/3 of his life. But so that I may add something to help explain these mythologies, do we not clearly see that ancient Demogorgon, the father of all the gods, or rather of all the members of the world, who is said to dwell in the center of the earth, covered with a green and rusty, iron-like, coat, nourishing all kinds of animals, is nothing other than the universal spirit. This is the spirit which, by God's command, brought forth the heavens from the chaos, together with the elements and all things in them, and which still sustains and enlivens all things to this day. For it truly took its dwelling in the middle of the earth, as we stated at the beginning of this book, where it sits as on a throne, and from there, as from the heart of some great body and the seat of universal life, it animates and nourishes everything. That green and iron-colored coat is nothing else than the surface of the earth itself, which is dark and iron-colored, and adorned and variegated with many-colored herbs and flowers. Virgil, who perfectly understood these mystical secrets, called this spirit or soul of the world Jupiter. It is this Jupiter whom the shepherd Damoedas invokes in his third eclogue, saying that all things are full of him. And Pan, the god of the woods, worshipped by shepherds, is understood in the same way. For besides the fact that the name Pan means all, he is also made the god of the woods because the Greeks worshipped chaos, which they also called Hyle, meaning wood or matter, as the governor of things. Orpheus addresses Pan like this: Pan, subtle, entire, and universal. All air, all water, all earth, and all immortal fire. Seated with time upon a single throne. In the lower, middle, and highest realms. Conceiving, engendering, bringing forth, and keeping all. The principle in everything, who brings all things to their end. Seed of fire, of air, of earth, and of wave. Great Spirit who gives life to all the members of the world. Who passes from all to all, changing their natures. Taking your place as universal soul in every body. To which you give being, mortality, and life. Showing through 1,000 effects your infinite power. In the old interpretation, Pan strong and subtle, great and universal, that art both fire, air, earth, water, and all, that reigns always and over everything, conceiving, begetting, producing, and keeping whatever has a beginning or shall have an end, that art both tree and fruit, both foe and friend, the spirit that binds together the parts of the world, that penetrates all natures, and imparts both life and motion, power to act and will, and that fills all things with your virtue. Saturn, the son of heaven and Vesta, the earth, and husband to Ops his sister, that preserving and helping power of all things, represents this same Demogorgon. Are not the children he first devours and then vomits up again simply the bodies to which he gives being, and which he finally draws back into himself, out of whom new bodies continually arise, so that by this perpetual cycle the order established in the beginning may be preserved until the end? He is sometimes painted with gray, dirty hair, his head covered, a sickle in his hand, and for his symbol a serpent coiled in a circle, biting its own tail. And well may he be painted old, for he is the grandfather of everything. His beard and hair are white and ever growing, that is, he is that which is always germinating. He is sordid and foul of himself, because of the earthly impurity that sticks to him, through his sulphurous and burning corruption. His head is covered, that is, the principle of perfection is shut up under a cover of impurity, so that few recognize it. His sickle is his penetration and mordacity, by which he pierces and devours all things. The serpent biting its own tail is his regenerating nature, through which he constantly renews himself, just as is told of the phoenix, by whose name he is sometimes also called. In this way he forever moves in a circular, unending increase. But I can already hear some say that I am missing the author's real intention in this fabulous description of Saturn, for, they claim, Saturn means lead, which of all the metals is the elder, and which devours all others with its crudity because it is full of salt. For mordacity comes from salt, as refiners of metals know from their tests. In these tests, lead vomits out the gold and silver it has swallowed but cannot consume, because in their cooking they received fixation, so that they can resist the weak heat of its stomach. I do not completely reject this interpretation, for in part it agrees with the other, and because in all essentials it fits with what I have given, I hope no one will say that my version is false. Maya represents the earth, so called because, from her as mother, the universal spirit or Mercury has its origin, and from the pure, invisible seed of Jupiter, which is the air. For, as the learned Cosmopolita says in his precious treatises, Mercury really proceeds from these. Mercury is commonly painted with wings, to show that he is of a volatile nature. His head is covered with a hat, for the same reason I gave earlier about Saturn's covered head. He carries a caduceus, a wand entwined with serpents, and fatal in its power, to signify his regenerative faculty, as I explained with Saturn's serpent. With this rod he opens heaven and earth and gives both life and death. That rod represents powerful nature itself, for by ascending into heaven and descending to earth, he acquires the forces both of the higher and the lower things. By this same power he draws souls out of hell and puts all eyes to sleep, as Virgil writes of him. Some also call him poison and theriac, that is, both life and death, according to how he is used and in what dose. For life consists in right balance and justice, death, in excess. Many other such mysteries are contained in this pagan theology, and they all aim at the same thing I am pointing to. If I were to explain all of them here, this treatise would swell into a large volume. I will not weary my reader with frequent repetition of the same matter. These examples are enough to show that all mythological commentaries of this sort, whether allegorical or historical, did not give occasion to the poet's fictions because any literal truth lay in those stories, but because they wanted chiefly to express the admirable operations of chemistry. Among others, consider the story of Jason and Medea, explained by Chrysogonus Polydorus. To his interpretation I will add only this: the name Medea, which means thought, meditation, or investigation, comes from a word that signifies principle, origin, or reason, for every meditation is surely grounded on some principle or reason. This Medea taught Jason, that is, the seeker or inquirer, two things, in which all philosophy consists. The winning of the golden fleece, that is, the art of changing metals and minerals. The restoration of bodies weakened by disease, by quickly and perfectly curing them, bringing them back from old age to youth and vigor by means of this one universal medicine. This medicine drives out all corrupt and corrupting humors and superfluities from bodies, which would otherwise bring them to their end. Jason achieved and perfected these miraculous effects by carefully following Medea's advice, but only after a long and dangerous voyage, exposed to many perils, both at sea, in slaying the dragon, and in taming the bulls. This voyage is the laborious search and uncertain experience of things, in which many spend their entire lives and never reach nature's harbor. The monstrous bulls that Jason has to tame and subdue are the furnaces in which the operations are performed. They are not badly represented by a bull's head in the fable, breathing fire from mouth and eyes, for the furnace must have some vents or openings, otherwise the fire would be smothered, and its heat could not be regulated in degree. Unless some experienced man governs the fire, many things will go wrong in the operations and disappoint the practitioner's hopes, as I myself have found. Out of 9 vessels that I placed in a furnace to give them a proper degree of heat, I lost 8 and saved only 1, but through that one I obtained the experiments I mentioned in the curing of diseases. The watchful dragon is that universal Mercury which Cadmus learned how to kill, that is, to fix, on the campus mortis where the teeth of the martial serpent were to be sown. This field of Mars is nothing else but a vessel in which soldiers armed with spears are lifted up. But this vessel should not be a glass alembic, as Polydorus thinks, but a vessel made in the form of a cover or hood, narrow at the bottom and wide above, made of good clay, well baked, and not of iron or glass. In its bottom the field of Mars must be raised up, bristling with lances and spears, representing soldiers stirred up and fighting. This is only a clever poetic fiction, invented to make the thing seem more marvelous to the common people, yet to us it is so plain and familiar that, if I openly named it, I would make myself ridiculous. When Jason had finished his work, he still had to make the watchful dragon that guarded the golden fleece fall asleep, so that it would no longer belch out fire and fumes. He did this by suffocating it in the Stygian waters, that is, by dissolving it and fixing it with its own spirit. After that, Jason had nothing more to do, for the possession of the golden fleece and the rejuvenation of his aged father Ezin, except the one remaining thing that Medea taught him, the fermentation and conjunction of solar butter with the paste of prepared mercury. For mercury by itself is not fit for two such excellent actions, it is only an earth in which a pure ferment, produced by nature and brought to perfection, must be sown. When he had completed this last work, Jason found himself master of a double treasure, which he triumphantly carried back to the land of his birth, and by its benefit he became very rich and restored his aged father to health, removing his infirmities. But now I will leave Jason with his Medea to enjoy their felicity, and only add this, that by the dragon who kept constant watch and vomited fire from his throat, nothing can be more fittingly signified than our universal spirit or mercury, which is the most lively and inflammable thing in the world. For this reason it is called burning water, or aqua vitae, because, as Brasescus notes, it always burns before it is coagulated, and it is called aqua vitae because it gives life to all things. If someone looked only at its surface, who would imagine it to be fixed and incombustible, seeing how easily it catches fire and vanishes at the slightest touch of flame? Who would guess that a conserving power lies in its center, when outwardly it seems more full of deadly poison than of life? Just as God placed a cherub with a flaming sword to guard the tree of life, so nature has set this fire-breathing dragon at the entrance of her garden, to guard the tree of the golden apples, that is, the knowledge of her hidden secrets. Our wise ancestors did not commit these to writing, but handed them on only by word of mouth, and then only to those whom they judged worthy of such knowledge. This is why those great and admirable sciences have gradually vanished and are now counted as fables and tales. Esdras considered this very point. He foresaw that the Israelites would undergo exile, flight, and captivity, and he feared that the secret mysteries of Scripture might perish because, without the aid of writing, human memory easily fails. Therefore he gathered together all the elders, 70 in number, and with them wrote all these things into as many books, as he himself testifies, saying that after 40 days the Lord spoke and said, "Publish the things you have written, so that everyone may read them, and keep the last 70 books, that you may give them to the wise men of your people. For in them is the vein of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the flood of knowledge." And so he did. Pico della Mirandola, the phoenix of his age for learning and knowledge, speaks of these books with great reverence, in words to this effect. These are the 70 Kabbalistic books in which Esdras plainly said that the fountain of all understanding and knowledge is contained, that is, the priceless theology concerning the supreme deity, the fountain of wisdom, and the complete metaphysics of intelligences, and the flood or stream of knowledge, that is, the firmest natural philosophy. When these books had long been kept secret, they were, by command of Sixtus IV, first translated into Latin for the good of religion, but his death broke off this good work. Among the Jews they are held in such reverence that no one under 40 years of age may touch them. And this is especially wonderful, that in those Kabbalistic doctrines there are some heads or points of Christian teaching. Thus speaks Mirandola. And now, having, as I hope, omitted nothing that might serve for interpreting Hermes's table or the obscure philosophical Kabbalah, I will withdraw to the harbor of this unfathomable ocean, and dry my wet clothes in the sunshine of your favor, wishing well to everyone, and on solid grounds judging that the true good, honor, and glory of the world is true philosophy. Finish.